1906, Fault Lines and Flavorless Flakes. Fall Asleep to Hilarious History by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. San Francisco's 5:12 a.m. wake-up call. By the year of our Lord 1906, humanity had become dangerously convinced that it had finally successfully negotiated a lease with the universe. We had the steam engine to do our heavy lifting, the telegraph to carry our gossip at the speed of lightning, and we were beginning to believe that the earth was less a planet and more a very large, silent footstool intended for our comfort. We were, as a species, feeling rather smug. We had survived the Victorian era without accidentally blowing up the moon, and the new century felt like a shiny new toy that wouldn't break if we squeezed it too hard. San Francisco, in particular, was the crown jewel of this collective delusion. They called it the Paris of the West, mostly because it had a great deal of culture, an alarming amount of wine, and a fog that could hide a multitude of sins, of which there were many. It was a city built on gold, luck, and an architectural philosophy that can best be described as optimistic tinder. It was a sprawling masterpiece of redwood and gingerbread trim, perched precariously on a series of hills that looked like they were waiting for something to happen. As it turns out, something was. On the morning of April 18th, 1906, the Earth decided that 5:12 a.m. was the perfect time for a performance review. Now, I have always maintained that nothing good has ever happened at 5 o'clock in the morning. It is an hour reserved for the dying, the hopelessly drunk, and people who think jogging is a substitute for a personality. To have the very foundation of your existence decide to turn itself into a liquid at that hour is not just a natural disaster, it is a personal insult. The San Andreas Fault, a geological feature that had been brooding in silence like a neglected spouse for decades, finally reached its breaking point. It didn't just shift, it didn't simply nudge, it performed a 290-mile-long violent shudder that suggested it was trying to shake humanity off its back like a stray dog tries to rid itself of a particularly persistent flea. For 48 seconds, the laws of physics took a coffee break. If you were a resident of San Francisco at that moment, your morning likely began with a sound that witnesses described as a roar, a deep subterranean growl that suggested a very large and very angry dragon was having a nightmare directly beneath your floorboards. Then came the shaking. This wasn't the gentle rocking of a cradle. This was the earth trying to play the maracas with your house. The city's high society, ensconced in the opulent Palace Hotel or the mansions of Nob Hill, found themselves abruptly reminded that gravity is a very egalitarian force. It does not care if your chandelier cost more than a small Midwestern farm. It will still drop it on your head. Enrico Caruso, the world-famous tenor who was in town for a performance, reportedly fled his hotel room clad in nothing but a fur coat and a look of profound betrayal, clutching a signed photograph of himself. One can only imagine the Earth's critique. "I've heard your high C, Enrico. Now listen to my low E flat." Down in the Barbary Coast, the city's more enthusiastic district, the chaos was slightly more democratic. Sailors, gamblers, and ladies of questionable leisure found themselves deposited into the streets in various states of undress. It was perhaps the only time in history that the city's clergy and its criminals were united in the same activity, falling down and shouting things that were technically blasphemous, but entirely appropriate for the circumstances. The problem with San Francisco wasn't just that it was built on a fault line. It was that it was built on hope. Large portions of the city, particularly the areas near the waterfront, were built on made land. This is a polite term engineers use for wet dirt and old trash we piled up until it looked solid. When the earthquake hit, this land underwent a process called liquefaction. The ground literally turned into a slurry. Cobblestones undulated like waves on the Pacific. Buildings didn't just fall, they sank, leaning into each other like tired revelers at the end of a long night. It took less than a minute. In the time it takes to boil an egg, assuming you have a stove and a house that isn't currently trying to somersault, the Paris of the West had been reduced to a surreal landscape of splintered redwood and twisted iron. But the tragedy of the human condition is that we are remarkably bad at taking a hint. As the dust began to settle, the survivors crawled out from the wreckage, brushed the plaster out of their hair, and looked around with a sort of dazed, "Well, that was unnecessary" expression. There was a brief, shimmering moment of silence, the kind of silence that usually precedes the punchline of a very dark joke. And then the smells began to drift through the air. You see, 5:12 a.m. is not just a terrible time for an earthquake, it is also the traditional time for the preparation of breakfast. Across the city, thousands of cast-iron stoves had been lit. When the houses collapsed, those stoves didn't just go out. They became small, iron-bound dragons of their own, nesting in piles of dry redwood kindling. Broken gas lines began to hiss, a sound like 1,000 angry vipers. The city's water mains, those vital arteries of civilization, had snapped like dry twigs. San Francisco had survived the shaking, but it was about to discover that while the earth might have started the fight, the fire was coming in to finish it. Standing in the ruins of Market Street, one could see the great San Francisco earthquake for what it truly was, a celestial eviction notice. We had spent the last century building dreadnought battleships that could level a coastline and silver ghost motor cars that could outrun a horse, but we hadn't yet figured out how to keep the floor from moving. We are a clever species, certainly. We can map the stars and we can split the atom, and we can even invent a cereal that tastes like a cardboard box in the name of moral purity. But in 1906, we were reminded that we are merely tenants on a very temperamental property. Mother Nature doesn't care about your Antiquities Act or your meat inspection clause. She is the landlord who, when she gets bored, likes to rearrange the furniture by throwing it out the window. As the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the Golden Gate, the people of San Francisco didn't know that the fires were just beginning. They didn't know that the army was on its way with enough dynamite to blow up what the earthquake had missed. They just knew that for the first time in their lives the ground had spoken, and it hadn't said anything particularly nice. The 20th century had arrived, and it didn't knock. It kicked the door down and asked if we liked what it had done with the place. Chapter 2. The Fire, the Inevitable Sequel. If the earthquake was the Earth's way of clearing its throat, the fire that followed was its way of delivering a 3-day lecture on the combustible nature of human hubris. You see, a city is a very intricate machine designed to keep its citizens dry, warm, and reasonably far away from the elements. But in 1906, San Francisco was primarily a machine designed to burn. It was a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle made of seasoned redwood, lace curtains, and Victorian wallpaper, all held together by the hopeful prayers of insurance agents who were about to have a very bad week. History has a cruel sense of timing. The shaking had barely stopped. The dust was still hovering in the air like a localized fog of pulverized plaster when the first wisps of smoke began to curl up from the ruins. In any other circumstance, a fire in a city is a manageable inconvenience, provided you have a fire department that isn't currently buried under its own ceiling. But San Francisco's fire chief, Dennis Sullivan, a man who knew every hydrant in the city by its first name, had the misfortune of having his bedroom floor vanish during the quake. He was mortally wounded before he could even reach for his boots, leaving the city's defense in the hands of a group of brave men who were about to discover that their primary weapon, water, had been replaced by a resounding silence. The great hydrant silence. When the firemen arrived at the first blazes, they did what firemen have done since the days of Nero. They looked for a hole in the ground to stick a hose into. They found the holes, but the water was gone. The earthquake had performed a surgical strike on the city's water mains, snapping the cast iron pipes as if they were made of peppermint sticks. Imagine, if you will, the frustration of a man standing in front of a growing inferno with a perfectly good hose in his hand and 1,000 gallons of water exactly 3 feet below his boots, yet completely inaccessible. It is the sort of cosmic joke that makes a man want to sit down and have a long talk with the Creator. Instead, these men tried to fight a dragon with damp rags. They used sewage water. They used wine from the cellars of the rich. In one particularly desperate instance, they reportedly used milk. It turns out that while milk is excellent for building strong bones, it is a remarkably poor deterrent for a citywide conflagration. As the morning progressed, the small, isolated fires began to realize they had a lot in common. They started to merge, forming what scientists call a conflagration, and what everyone else calls the end of the world. The heat became so intense that it created its own weather system. A firestorm doesn't just sit there and wait for things to burn. It creates a vacuum that sucks in fresh air, which in turn feeds the flames, creating a self-sustaining cycle of destruction that would make a parasite jealous. The general and the boom theory of firefighting. Enter Brigadier General Frederick Funston. Now, General Funston was a man of action. He was the kind of man who, when faced with a problem, immediately looks for something to explode. Seeing that the water was gone and the fire was moving toward the more expensive parts of town, Funston decided that the U.S. Army should intervene. His logic was simple, elegant, and entirely catastrophic. If there are no buildings for the fire to eat, the fire will eventually starve to death. It is a beautiful theory on paper. In practice, it involved the military marching into neighborhoods and telling people to move their pianos into the street because their house was about to become a firebreak. The Army began to use dynamite to level rows of houses ahead of the flames. There were, however, 2 slight flaws in this plan. First, the soldiers were not exactly demolition experts. They were more enthusiastic amateurs with access to high explosives. Second, when you blow up a wooden building with dynamite, you do not actually make the wood disappear. You simply turn a large standing piece of fuel into 1,000 smaller jagged pieces of fuel, which you then generously distribute over the surrounding area. Instead of stopping the fire breaks often acted as kindling. The dynamite blasts would blow out windows and doors in nearby buildings, creating a nice breezy draft that invited the fire inside for a visit. It was a bit like trying to put out a campfire by hitting it with a shovel. You might succeed in the end, but you're going to get a lot of sparks on your shins in the meantime. The great relocation of useless objects. As the fire moved through the city, the citizens of San Francisco began a strange somnambulistic parade. When a human being realizes their house is about to be erased from the map, the brain does not always choose the most logical items to save. People were seen dragging heavy trunks filled with winter coats through the April heat. One man was spotted cradling a bird cage with no bird in it, while another had managed to save a massive gilt-framed portrait of an ancestor he openly loathed. The streets became a bazaar of the absurd. Pianos were abandoned on the sidewalks like beached whales. Sewing machines, those heavy cast-iron symbols of Edwardian industry, were dragged for miles until their owners simply collapsed from exhaustion. There is something profoundly moving and deeply ridiculous about a woman refusing to leave her burning home until she has found her favorite hat, only to realize that she no longer has a head to put it on because she's too busy crying over her lost spoons. By the second day, the Paris of the West looked less like a city and more like a charcoal drawing of a nightmare. The smoke was visible from 100 miles away. The sun appeared as a sickly copper disk in a sky that had turned the color of an old bruise. The logic of the rubble. The fire didn't just destroy, it revealed. It revealed that the grand stone facades of the city's finest buildings were often just thin veneers over the same redwood skeletons that made up the slums. It revealed that the city's modern infrastructure was held together by little more than hope and corrupt city contracts. And it revealed that when the chips are down and the floor is on fire, the difference between a millionaire and a dock worker is primarily the quality of the shoes they are wearing while they run away. The military eventually declared martial law, which is a fancy way of saying that if they caught you looking at a piece of abandoned jewelry too long, they might shoot you to save the government the paperwork of a trial. It was a time of immense bravery and staggering incompetence. People were sharing their last crusts of bread in the morning and watching the army blow up their livelihoods in the afternoon. As the sun went down on the second night, the fire had reached the edge of Van Ness Avenue. This was the city's widest street, and it was here that the final stand would be made. The army brought in more dynamite. The firemen found a few remaining trickles of water, and the wind, perhaps tired of the destruction, finally began to shift. But the damage was done. The city had survived the shaking, but it had been dismantled by the very things that made it a city: its gas, its wood, and its own frantic attempts to save itself. It turns out that while Mother Nature holds the veto power, humanity is more than happy to provide the pen. Chapter 3. The Ham and Eggs Fire. If there is one thing that distinguishes the human race from the common garden slug, aside from our regrettable tendency to wear neckties, it is our absolute, unwavering commitment to the concept of breakfast. You can shake a man's house until the roof becomes the floor. You can tilt his world at a 45-degree angle and toss his fine china into the street. But you cannot, under any circumstances, expect him to face the apocalypse on an empty stomach. The morning of April 18th, 1906, was a testament to this digestive stubbornness. After the great shake had subsided, and while the rest of the city was still vibrating like a tuning fork, a certain woman on Hayes Street decided that the most logical response to a tectonic catastrophe was to fry some ham. Now, we do not know this woman's name with absolute certainty. History has a way of erasing the names of people who accidentally burned down several square miles of real estate, perhaps out of a sense of witness protection. But we know her spirit. She was the quintessential American optimist. She looked at a city in ruins, sighed at the dust on her drapes, and thought, well, the world may be ending, but I'll be damned if my family starts the great beyond without a side of pork. The stove, a cast-iron betrayal. In 1906, the kitchen stove was not the sleek, obedient rectangle of buttons we know today. It was a massive, surly beast of cast iron that required a constant diet of wood or coal and had the temperament of a cornered badger. To light a stove in a Victorian kitchen was to engage in a delicate negotiation with the forces of combustion. Our heroine approached her stove with the confidence of a woman who had mastered the art of the flapjack. She struck a match, a simple act of domesticity, and dropped it into the belly of the iron beast. What she did not know, what she could not have known without the benefit of X-ray vision or a degree in structural engineering, was that the earthquake had turned her chimney into a vertical collection of loose bricks held together by nothing but habit and gravity. When she lit that fire, the heat and smoke didn't go up and out into the crisp morning air. Instead, the sparks took a scenic detour through the cracks in the masonry and settled comfortably into the dry redwood lath of the kitchen walls. It was a quiet beginning. While the woman focused on the sizzle of the ham and the perfect consistency of her eggs, the house was quietly eating itself from the inside out. It is a profound metaphor for the era, really. The middle class sitting down to a sensible meal, while the very walls that sheltered them were being consumed by the consequences of their own industry. The most expensive breakfast in history. By the time the smell of burning wood overtook the aroma of breakfast, it was too late. The ham and eggs fire, as it came to be known with a sort of grim culinary affection, was born. In a city with working water mains, this would have been a one-alarm affair, a frantic scramble with buckets, a few choice words from the husband, and a week of sleeping on the sofa for the cook. But as we established in our last installment, the San Francisco water system was currently enjoying a sabbatical. The fire leaped from the Hayes Street house to its neighbor with the enthusiasm of a long-lost relative. From there, it went on a tour of the district. It didn't have the brute force of the south of Market Inferno, which was a wall of flame a mile wide. No, the ham and eggs fire was a more tactical, sneaky sort of disaster. It meandered. It took its time. It appreciated the architecture. It eventually consumed a vast swath of the city, including the magnificent City Hall, a building that had cost $6 million to build and about 6 cents to maintain, judging by how quickly its fireproof walls crumbled. It turns out that when you build a government building using more graft and corruption than actual mortar, it tends to behave poorly under pressure. The fire stripped the building down to its skeletal dome, leaving it looking like a giant charred birdcage, a fitting monument to the civic leaders who had pocketed the plumbing budget. The gastronomic ego. There is something uniquely American about the ham and eggs fire. It represents our fundamental belief that business as usual is a holy commandment. We see this throughout 1906. While the city was a smoldering ruin, people were still trying to find their morning newspapers. There were reports of men standing in the middle of rubble-strewn streets, meticulously polishing their shoes. We are a species that finds comfort in the mundane. If the sky is falling, we want to make sure our tie is straight. If the ground is opening up, we want to make sure the ham isn't overcooked. It is a form of collective insanity that we call grit. The woman on Hayes Street wasn't the only one. All across the city, dozens of post-quake breakfast fires were springing up. It was a synchronized, citywide attempt to fry, boil, and toast our way back to normalcy. We were literally burning the city down to stay on schedule. The aftermath of the omelet. When the historians finally tallied the bill, the ham and eggs fire was credited with destroying more than 20 city blocks. It is, by any metric, the most expensive breakfast ever prepared. One hopes the eggs were at least over easy and the ham was cut thick, because that meal cost the equivalent of several grand theaters, a few hundred homes, and a significant portion of the city's dignity. The fire department, led by men who are now operating on 48 hours of no sleep and a diet of pure adrenaline, could only watch. They had no water, their chief was dead, and their only remaining strategy was to blow things up. But even dynamite has its limits. You can't blow up a breakfast fire that has already decided to become a neighborhood. As the Hayes Valley area turned into a sea of red-hot embers, the lesson of 1906 became clear. Civilization is a very thin crust sitting atop a very large stove. We spend our lives worrying about the big things, the shifting of empires, the movements of markets, the grand designs of fate. But in the end, it's usually a broken chimney and a craving for protein that brings the whole thing crashing down. The woman on Hayes Street likely fled with her family, perhaps still holding a spatula, watching as the Paris of the West turned into a giant smokehouse. She had achieved the ultimate American dream. She had made an impact. She had started a conversation. She had also started a fire that could be seen from space. But in the world of 1906, you took your fame wherever you could find it. Chapter 4. Reconstruction and the Great Insurance Grift. There is a particular type of optimism that can only be found in the heart of a man who has just watched his life's work turn into a pile of glowing charcoal. It is not the noble, quiet optimism of the martyr. It is the twitchy, caffeinated optimism of the entrepreneur who realizes that while he has lost his shop, he has gained a spectacular amount of unobstructed views. By late April 1906, the smoke over San Francisco had shifted from the black of burning redwood to the gray of bureaucratic indecision. The city was no longer a place of residence. It was a 400-block crime scene, and the chief suspects were God, the San Andreas Fault, and a few thousand insurance adjusters who were currently boarding trains for the East Coast with the panicked expressions of men who had accidentally bet their life savings on a horse that turned out to be a three-legged mule. The Great Semantic War, Fire versus Quake. To understand the reconstruction of San Francisco, one must first understand the legal distinction between an act of God and a mechanical failure of the kitchen stove. This distinction was worth approximately $250 million in 1906 currency, or in modern terms, enough money to buy a small European principality and still have change left for a very nice hat. Most insurance policies of the era had a fallen building clause. This was a delightful little piece of fine print that stated if a building fell down due to an earthquake before it caught fire, the insurance company owed the owner exactly $0.00. They argued that once the building was a pile of rubble, it was no longer a building, and therefore you couldn't insure a pile of bricks against fire any more than you could insure a puddle against drowning. This led to the greatest spontaneous outbreak of arson in human history. Homeowners, realizing that their earthquake-shattered houses were worth nothing, but their fire-damaged houses were worth a fortune, began to help the fire along. People were seen throwing kerosene on their remaining floorboards, while the fire was still 3 blocks away, shouting, "Look! It's catching. It's definitely a fire. Call the man with the checkbook." It was a civic-minded effort to ensure that the insurance industry shared in the local flavor of the disaster. The Rhine and Moselle Shuffle. While American companies like Aetna and Hartford generally behaved with a terrifying degree of honesty, mostly because they knew where the policyholders lived, the European companies were a different story. The Rhine and Moselle Company of Germany, for instance, took one look at the claims coming out of San Francisco and decided that the best way to handle the situation was to stop answering the telephone and eventually cease to exist entirely. Their strategy was essentially, "We would love to pay you for your lost grocery store, but unfortunately, we have decided to go into the business of being invisible. Good luck with the rubble." This created a new class of San Franciscan, the insurance refugee. These were people who had survived the shaking, survived the fire, and were now being systematically dismantled by a man in a pinstripe suit with a fountain pen. It turns out that a force majeure clause is the only thing in nature more destructive than a tectonic plate. The birth of the urban developer, a new species of predator. As the ruins cooled, a new creature emerged from the ash, the modern urban developer. Prior to 1906, building a city was a slow generational process of adding a brick here and a cornice there. But San Francisco was now a blank canvas, and every man with a shovel and a permit saw himself as Michelangelo, provided Michelangelo was interested in high-density rental units and cutting corners on foundation bolts. There was a grand plan, of course. Daniel Burnham, the legendary architect who had designed the White City in Chicago, had presented a plan for San Francisco just a year prior. It involved wide boulevards, neoclassical parks, and a layout that would have made the city look like a Greek god had tripped and fallen into the Pacific. The people of San Francisco looked at Burnham's beautiful maps, looked at the smoking holes in the ground where their businesses used to be, and said, "That's lovely, Daniel. Now please get out of the way so we can build a 3-story wooden warehouse exactly where the old one was before the sun goes down." Speed was the only god left. The city didn't rebuild. It sprouted. We saw the birth of the taxpayer strip, cheap 1-story buildings thrown up in days to generate enough rent to pay the property taxes. The aesthetic shifted from Paris of the West to lumberyard chic. Mayor Schmitz, and the graft of the century. You cannot talk about the Reconstruction without mentioning Mayor Eugene Schmitz and his puppeteer, boss Abe Ruff. Schmitz was a former violin player who had been elected by the Union Labor Party, and he played the city's budget with the same virtuosity he applied to his fiddle. In the wake of the quake, the Schmitz roof machine realized that rubble removal was the greatest business opportunity since the invention of the wheel. They sold permits to rebuild. They sold rights to move debris. They even managed to make a profit on the emergency bread lines. It was a master class in civic parasitism. They argued that the city was too busy rebuilding to worry about minor things like accountability or not stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. And since the earthquake had conveniently shaken the nails loose, there was a lot of moving capital. The rebuilding of San Francisco was funded by insurance money that didn't want to be paid, managed by politicians who didn't want to be watched, and executed by workers who were mostly trying to avoid being hit by falling bricks. The irony of the steel frame. The one silver lining, if you can call a scorched skeleton a silver lining, was the discovery that the newfangled steel frame buildings had actually survived the quake quite well. While the brick and mortar buildings had crumbled like stale crackers, the steel skeletons of the Call Building and the Fairmont Hotel had stood their ground. This changed the DNA of the American city. We realized that if we wanted to live on a fault line, we had to stop building like 15th century monks and start building like 20th century blacksmiths. The skyscraper wasn't just a symbol of ego, it was a survival strategy. By the end of 1906, San Francisco was a forest of steel beams, and the air was filled with the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of riveting hammers. It was the sound of a city refusing to take no for an answer from the universe. We were rebuilding on the same cracks, with the same optimism, and often with the same forged paperwork as before. The great insurance grift taught us that the only thing more persistent than a natural disaster is a human being with a mortgage. We will build on sand, we will build on trash, and we will build on the literal edge of a cliff, provided we can find a lawyer who says the insurance will cover it. Chapter 5. The Meat Inspection Act, the Sausage Clause. While the citizens of San Francisco were busy discovering that their homes were essentially high-stakes kindling, the rest of the American public was having a collective realization that was, in many ways, much harder to swallow. They were discovering that for the last several decades, they hadn't just been eating dinner. They had been participating in a botanical and zoological scavenger hunt. The year 1906 marks the moment when the United States government decided to stop treating food safety as a polite suggestion and started treating it as a matter of national security. Before this, the American meatpacking industry operated on a philosophy that can best be described as, if it fits in the tin, it's protein. It was a golden age of culinary mystery, a time when the only thing you could be absolutely certain was in your sausage was the casing. And even then, you didn't want to ask too many questions about the casing's previous employment. The man who ruined breakfast, Upton Sinclair. The catalyst for this sudden interest in the contents of our larders was a young, earnest socialist named Upton Sinclair. Now, Sinclair didn't set out to fix the meat industry. He set out to fix the soul of the working class. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which was intended to be a searing indictment of capitalism, that would lead the American public to embrace socialism with open arms. He aimed for the public's heart, but as he later famously lamented, he accidentally hit them in the stomach. Sinclair spent weeks undercover in the Chicago stockyards, taking notes on things that would make a vulture gag. He described a world where rats were an integral part of the spice profile, where floor sweepings were considered a valid filler, and where men who fell into the rendering vats were occasionally tinned and sold as Durham's pure leaf lard. When the book hit the shelves in early 1906, it became an instant bestseller, mostly because people wanted to know if the special summer ham they'd just bought was actually a former neighbor named Clarence. It was the first time in history that a work of literature acted as a mass-market emetic. Teddy Roosevelt and the Breakfast Table Crisis. President Theodore Roosevelt was a man of many appetites, but even he had his limits. Legend has it that T.R. was reading The Jungle while eating breakfast when he came across a particularly vivid description of the potted ham process. He reportedly threw his plate out the window and shouted something along the lines of "bully," though in this context it was less an exclamation of joy and more a declaration of war. Roosevelt was already skeptical of the Beef Trust. He had served in the Spanish-American War, where he'd seen more of his men killed by embalmed beef than by Spanish bullets. He knew that the meat-packing titans were essentially alchemists, capable of turning spoiled gray gristle into premium choice through the liberal application of borax, formaldehyde, and hope. The industry's defense was a masterpiece of Edwardian gaslighting. They argued that regulation was an un-American intrusion into the sanctity of the sausage. They claimed that the distinctive tang of Chicago beef was a trade secret that would be ruined by the prying eyes of a government inspector. They essentially argued that the American consumer had a right to eat rat-flavored mystery meat, and that to take that away was a violation of the Constitution. The Sausage Clause and the inspectors. The result of this public outcry was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. It was a piece of legislation that introduced a radical new concept to the American economy: the idea that the person selling you a product shouldn't be allowed to kill you with it. The act mandated that the Department of Agriculture inspect all cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. Yes, horses were a significant part of the don't ask, don't tell meat economy, before and after they were slaughtered. It also set up strict, for the time, standards of cleanliness. This gave birth to a new American folk hero, the meat inspector. These were men whose job was to walk into a factory and ask inconvenient questions like, "Why is that pile of sawdust labeled extra fine bolognese?" Or, "Does that ham have a pulse?" For the first time, the government put its stamp on a carcass, effectively telling the consumer, "We've looked at this, and we're reasonably sure it was once an animal." The Pure Food and Drug Act, the end of Aunt Martha's soothing syrup. While T.R. was busy with the meat, he also decided to take a look at the medicine cabinet. 1906 also saw the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was a devastating blow to the patent medicine industry. Before 1906, if you had a headache, you could go to the local druggist and buy a bottle of Dr. Goodvibe's Celestial Elixir. The label would promise to cure everything from tuberculosis to a stubborn personality. What the label wouldn't tell you was that the elixir was 40% grain alcohol, 10% opium, and 50% proprietary swamp water. You didn't actually get better, you just became far too intoxicated to care that you were dying. The 1906 Act required that active ingredients like alcohol, cocaine, heroin, and morphine be listed on the label. It was a revolutionary idea, the label. It turns out that when people realize their cough suppressant is actually liquid heroin, they start to look at their pharmacist with a bit more suspicion. The moral implications of a clean kitchen. The Meat Inspection Act wasn't just about health, it was about the loss of American innocence. We had moved from a nation of small-town butchers who knew your name to a nation of industrial giants who only knew your credit limit. We had to outsource our trust to a man with a clipboard and a federal badge. There is a profound irony in the fact that Upton Sinclair, who wanted to overhaul the entire economic structure of Western civilization, ended up just making sure our hot dogs were slightly less adventurous. He wanted to change the world's heart, but he settled for cleaning the world's sink. By the end of 1906, the American dinner table was a safer, albeit slightly more boring place. We lost the mystery of the mystery meat, but we gained the ability to survive a Sunday roast. It was a year where we learned that progress doesn't just mean building faster ships or taller buildings. Sometimes progress is just making sure the ham hasn't been used as a floor mat before it hits the pan. As T.R. famously put it, the goal was to give the average man a square deal. And in 1906, that deal finally included a square piece of meat that wasn't 30% wood pulp. It wasn't socialism, and it wasn't the jungle that Sinclair envisioned, but for a nation currently recovering from an earthquake and a fire, a reliable sandwich was a good place to start. Chapter 6. The Antiquities Act. Saving Rocks from People. If there is one thing that defines the character of the American citizen more than his love of liberty or his suspicious relationship with the truth, it is his pathological need to take a piece of the scenery home with him. We are a nation of souvenir hunters. If an American stands before the Great Pyramid of Giza, his first thought isn't, "How did they build this?" but rather, "I wonder if I can fit one of those smaller cornerstones in my steamer trunk." By 1906, the American West had become a giant open-air gift shop where everything was free if you had a sturdy shovel and a complete lack of a moral compass. We had pot hunters scouring the Southwest for Anasazi pottery like they were looking for loose change in a sofa. We had tourists chipping away at the petrified forest until it was essentially the slightly damp wood forest. We were a people possessed by the strange idea that a majestic mountain was just a collection of future paperweights waiting to be harvested. The great plunder of the scientific kind. It wasn't just the casual tourists, mind you. The real professionals were the archaeologists from back east and Europe. These were gentlemen with very expensive degrees and very large crates, who believed that the best place for an ancient indigenous ruin was in a basement in New Jersey or a museum in Berlin. Their logic was airtight. We must steal these artifacts to preserve them from the people who might steal them. It was a race to see who could save history by removing it from the spot where it actually happened. Enter Theodore Roosevelt. Now, T.R. was a man who viewed the American wilderness as a cross between a holy cathedral and a shooting gallery. He loved nature with a ferocious, toothy intensity, and he was beginning to realize that if someone didn't pass a law soon, the Grand Canyon would eventually be reduced to a hole in the ground filled with discarded sandwich wrappers and missing its most iconic boulders. The law that said, "Stop touching things." On June 8, 1906, Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act. It was a short, punchy piece of legislation that essentially gave the president the power to point at a rock, a forest, or a ruin and say, "This is mine," or rather, "This is the public's, and if I catch you with a chisel near it, I will have you relocated to a place with very small windows and no scenery at all." It allowed the president to declare national monuments by executive order. This was a stroke of genius because it bypassed Congress. And as anyone who has spent more than 5 minutes in Washington, D.C. knows, Congress is where good ideas go to be nibbled to death by people who are worried about the mining interests of their second cousins. Roosevelt knew that if he asked for permission to save the West, he'd still be waiting for the subcommittee to finish their lunch in 1950. Devil's Tower, nature's giant middle finger. The first beneficiary of this act was a geological oddity in Wyoming known as Devil's Tower. It is a massive, igneous intrusion that looks like a giant petrified tree stump, or perhaps a stone thumb that the earth is sticking up to test the wind. Roosevelt declared it the first national monument in September 1906. It was a brilliant choice. It's hard to steal a rock that is 867 feet tall. Though I'm sure there were a few entrepreneurs in Cheyenne already sketching out plans for a very large pulley system and a catalog for genuine Wyoming sky slabs. By declaring it a monument, TR wasn't just saving a rock. He was setting a precedent. He was telling the American people that some things are more valuable as they are than they are as gravel. The Grand Canyon and the big stick of conservation. The real test of the Antiquities Act, however, came with the Grand Canyon. In 1906, the canyon was under threat from everyone. Mining companies wanted to dig it up for copper. Water companies wanted to dam it. And I suspect some visionary was already thinking about building a hotel that hung over the edge by a single, optimistic rope. Congress, being Congress, refused to make it a national park. They argued it was just a big hole and that we had plenty of holes already. Roosevelt, losing patience with the speed of legislative progress, looked at the Antiquities Act and realized it didn't specify how small a monument had to be. He essentially decided that the entire Grand Canyon, all 800,000 acres of it, was an object of scientific interest. It was a classic Roosevelt move. He took a law intended to protect small ruins and used it to protect a geological abyss that you could see from the moon. When the mining companies complained that he was overstepping his bounds, he essentially told them that if they didn't like it, they could try to sue the canyon itself, but they should be careful because it was quite deep and he wouldn't be providing any ladders. Leave it as it is. You cannot improve on it. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it. Theodore Roosevelt, practicing his outdoor voice. The irony of the ancient American. There is a delicious irony in Americans passing an Antiquities Act in 1906. At the time, the United States was barely 130 years old. We were a nation of teenagers trying to pass laws to protect our ancient heritage. To a European, An antiquity is a Roman Colosseum or a Greek temple that has been falling down with dignity for 2,000 years. To an American in 1906, an antiquity was a particularly old-looking pine tree or a cliff dwelling that had been abandoned while the ink was still wet on the Declaration of Independence. But that was the point. We didn't have cathedrals built by kings. We had canyons carved by rivers. We didn't have marble statues of emperors. We had giant stone fingers in Wyoming. The Antiquities Act was our way of admitting that while we were very good at building steam engines and dreadnoughts, we couldn't build a sunset, and we certainly couldn't build a red rock mesa. The legacy of the chisel. Because of the 1906 Act, we stopped the bleeding, mostly. We saved the Mesa Verde ruins from being used as decorative planters in New York penthouses. We saved the Olympic Peninsula from being turned into a giant collection of toothpicks. Of course, the American urge to leave a mark never truly vanished. We just shifted from stealing the rocks to carving our names into them. We went from pot hunting to Kilroy was here. But thanks to T.R. and his 1906 pen, the great American scenery was given a fighting chance. We learned that progress doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes progress is just standing perfectly still and refusing to let anyone with a sledgehammer near the view. It was a year where we decided that our antiquities weren't just things we found in the dirt, but the dirt itself. And as the year 1906 rolled on, with San Francisco still smoldering and the meat-packing plants finally smelling slightly more like beef and slightly less like a chemistry experiment, the national monuments stood silent. They were the only things in the country that weren't being rearranged, shaken, or fried for breakfast. They were, quite literally, the foundation of the nation, and for the first time, the law agreed. Chapter 7. The Brownsville Affair. If Theodore Roosevelt were a chemical element, he would be something highly unstable, prone to spontaneous combustion, and likely to leave a very bright glow on everything he touched. He was a man who lived his life at the volume of a brass band falling down a flight of stairs. He was the progressive president, the trust buster, the nature lover, and the man who famously claimed he wanted to give every American a square deal. However, as the 167 men of the 25th Infantry Regiment discovered in the late summer of 1906, the square deal occasionally had some very sharp, jagged edges, particularly if you happened to be black in a country that was still trying to decide if the Civil War had actually ended or if it was just on a very long, bitter intermission. The Midnight Mystery in Brownsville. The scene was Brownsville, Texas in August. Now, Texas in August is not a place. It is a thermal event. It is the kind of heat that makes a man's thoughts turn to either religion or homicide, and usually in that order. The 25th Infantry, an all-black regiment with a distinguished record that stretched back to the frontier, had been stationed at Fort Brown. The local townspeople, whose hospitality can best be described as actively hostile, were not pleased. They greeted the soldiers with the kind of warmth usually reserved for a plague of locusts. On the night of August 13th, 1906, the tension finally snapped. Around midnight, a series of gunshots rang out in the streets of Brownsville. When the smoke cleared, literally and metaphorically, one local bartender was dead, and a police officer was wounded. The townspeople immediately pointed their fingers at the fort. They didn't need evidence. They had intuition, which in 1906 Texas was a legally recognized substitute for facts. They claimed that a group of black soldiers had gone on a rampage. The soldiers, for their part, swore they had been in their barracks, under lock and key, during the entire episode. Their officers confirmed this. The rifles were inspected and found to be clean. But then someone found evidence. A collection of spent shell casings was discovered in the street. Curiously, they were the exact type used by the Army's new Springfield rifles. It was almost too perfect, like finding a calling card at a burglary that says, "I did it. Sincerely, the guy who lives at the fort." The conspiracy of silence. When the news reached Washington, Theodore Roosevelt didn't just walk softly. He grabbed his big stick and started swinging it at anything that moved. T.R. had a mystical, almost fanatical devotion to the honor of the uniform. To him, the military was a sacred priesthood, and any stain on its reputation was a personal insult to his own Rough Rider ego. The Army conducted an investigation that would have made a Spanish inquisitor blush. They demanded that the soldiers name the guilty parties. The soldiers, who maintained they were innocent and therefore didn't have any names to give, said nothing. Roosevelt interpreted this as a conspiracy of silence. In T.R.'s mind, if you didn't have a villain to hand over, it meant you were all villains. He didn't care about the rule of law or due process. Those were things for lawyers and people who didn't have a mustache that required its own zip code. He wanted a resolution, and he wanted it with the speed of a cavalry charge. The Rough Rider's blind spot. In a move that shocked even some of his supporters, Roosevelt issued a summary order without a trial, without a hearing, and without a shred of actual proof linking any specific man to the crime. He dishonorably discharged all 167 black soldiers of the 3 companies involved. This wasn't just a "you're fired." A dishonorable discharge in 1906 meant you lost your pension, you were barred from all future federal employment, and you were essentially cast out of society with a permanent mark of shame. Many of these men were Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. Some had fought alongside Roosevelt himself at San Juan Hill. It was a staggering betrayal. It was the square deal being folded into an origami crane and thrown into the trash. The man who had invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, causing a scandal that nearly shook the paint off the walls, was now tossing nearly 200 black heroes into the gutter based on the word of a Texas lynch mob and some conveniently placed brass shells. The only thing worse than a man who doesn't keep his word is a man who keeps it only when it's convenient for his brand. An observation Mark Twain might have made if he weren't so busy trying to figure out how to patent his own sarcasm. The irony of the progressive era. The Brownsville affair reveals the great gaping hole in the progressive heart of the early 1900s. We were a nation obsessed with efficiency and reform. We were cleaning up the meatpacking plants. We were saving the Grand Canyon, and we were building the Panama Canal. We were perfecting America. But for Roosevelt and his contemporaries, perfection often had a racial ceiling. You could be a hero on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion, especially a court presided over by a man who viewed himself as the ultimate arbiter of morality, your skin color could still be used as a circumstantial evidence of guilt. The political fallout was immense. Black voters who had viewed the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln after all, as their natural home, began to look elsewhere. The Rough Rider had finally ridden over the very people who had helped him reach the top of the hill. The long walk to justice. History is often a slow-moving beast, and in the case of Brownsville, it was practically glacial. It wasn't until 1972, 66 years after the fact, that the U.S. Army finally admitted that the discharge was a gross injustice. They changed the records to honorable and offered a small amount of back pay to the only survivors still living and the descendants of the rest. By then, of course, the men were gone. The square deal had arrived 6 decades too late to be of any use for lunch. The Brownsville affair stands as a reminder that 1906 wasn't just a year of earthquakes and fires, it was a year of human tremors. While the earth was shaking in San Francisco, the foundations of American justice were cracking in Texas. We were a nation in a hurry to be great, and in our haste, we didn't mind tripping over the truth if it meant we could get to the finish line faster. As Roosevelt moved on to his next adventure, likely something involving a leopard and a very large gun, the 167 men of the 25th Infantry were left to find their own way in an America that had decided their service was worth less than a handful of spent shells in a dusty Texas street. Chapter 8. HMS Dreadnought, the boat that broke the Navy. If there is one thing that the human male loves more than a well-marbled steak or a comfortable chair in which to avoid his family, it is a big gun. History is, at its heart, a very long and very expensive catalog of men trying to build a louder, shinier, and more terrifying way to hit things from a distance. By 1906, this obsession had moved from the handheld pistol to the floating fortress, and the British Empire, a collection of islands held together by tea, Victorian repression, and the world's largest navy, decided it was time to build the ultimate conversation piece. Enter the HMS Dreadnought. Now, to understand the Dreadnought, you must understand the state of the world's navies in 1905. A battleship of that era was a cluttered, confused affair. It was covered in a variety of guns of all different sizes, ranging from massive cannons that could level a village to tiny little pop guns intended to shoo away mosquitoes or particularly aggressive seagulls. When a battle started, the smoke from the small guns made it impossible for the big guns to see what they were hitting, and the whole thing was about as organized as a barn dance in a thunderstorm. The man with the plan, Admiral Jackie Fisher, the mastermind behind this nautical madness, was Admiral Sir John Jackie Fisher, a man who lived his life as if he were perpetually being chased by a swarm of bees. Fisher was the first Sea Lord, and he was possessed by a singular, frantic vision. Speed is armor. Fisher was a kind of man who thought in exclamation points. He didn't just want a better boat. He wanted a boat that would make every other captain on the planet sit down and weep into his grog. He wanted a ship that was nothing but all big guns. No more secondary batteries, no more auxiliary nonsense, just 10 massive 12-inch cannons that could deliver a telegram of total destruction to anyone within 10 miles. Fisher's philosophy was simple: hit first, hit hard, and keep on hitting. It was a lovely sentiment, provided you weren't the one being hit. He took over the Portsmouth Royal Dockyard and, through a combination of brilliant logistics and what I suspect was a significant amount of terror, he managed to build the dreadnought in just 1 year and 1 day. For context, it usually takes a government 3 years just to decide on the color of the curtains for the admiral's cabin. The ship that made everything else a toy. When the HMS Dreadnought was launched in February 1906, it wasn't just a new ship. It was a biological reset for the ocean. It was the first major warship powered by steam turbines. This meant it didn't just chug along like a soot-stained Victorian factory. It hissed through the water at 21 knots. It was faster, bigger, and more heavily armored than anything else afloat. But the real kicker was the guns. Because all the guns were the same size, the ship could use a centralized fire control system. For the first time, a ship could aim all its cannons at once, creating a broadside that could turn a rival battleship into a collection of very expensive driftwood in a single volley. The moment the dreadnought hit the water, every other battleship on Earth became a pre-dreadnought. This is a polite naval term for a floating target. Imagine you have spent your entire life and the National Treasury building a collection of the world's finest horse-drawn carriages. You have hundreds of them. You are the king of carriages. And then your neighbor walks out of his garage with a brand new Ferrari. Your carriages aren't just slower, they are suddenly, profoundly irrelevant. That was the dreadnought. The strategic blunder of the century. Now, here is where the wit of the British Empire truly shines. You see, in 1906, Britain already had the largest navy in the world. They had dozens of battleships. They were the undisputed lords of the sea. By inventing the dreadnought, Britain essentially told the rest of the world, everything we currently own is now garbage. We are starting the score back at zero. If you start building these new ships today, you'll be exactly as powerful as we are. It was the most polite way to commit strategic suicide I have ever seen. It was like a man who owns all the gold in the world deciding to declare that from now on, the only thing that has value is seashells, and then realizing he doesn't have any seashells. The German Empire, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man who suffered from a severe case of navy envy, took one look at the dreadnought and smiled. The Kaiser had been trying to catch up to the British for years, but he couldn't compete with their sheer numbers. But now the race had been reset. Germany didn't have to build 100 old ships. They just had to build more dreadnoughts than the British. To build a ship that makes your own fleet obsolete is the height of industrial genius. It is also the height of tactical insanity. It is like burning down your own mansion because you've invented a slightly more efficient fireplace. A thought that might have occurred to a midshipman had he been allowed to think. The bankruptcy arms race. What followed was the dreadnought race, a period of history where every major power in Europe decided that the only way to ensure peace was to spend every cent of their citizens' money on massive steel tubs. Britain built a dreadnought. Germany built 2. Britain built 4. The taxpayers of Europe, who were mostly interested in things like bread and not dying of smallpox, watched as their hard-earned wages were melted down and turned into armor plating. The dreadnought became a symbol of the age. It was a machine built for a war that everyone was terrified of, but that everyone was now meticulously preparing for. These ships were so expensive that no one actually wanted to use them. They were like the fine china of the military world, too precious to be brought out for a common scrap, intended only for the most formal of apocalypses. The irony of the dreadnought. The name dreadnought comes from the Old English for fear nothing. It was a bold claim. But the reality was that the dreadnought made everyone fear everything. It created a world of silent signals and hair-triggered tensions. It turned the North Sea into a giant chessboard where the pieces cost more than the kingdoms they were defending. And the ultimate irony? The HMS Dreadnought, this world-shattering, navy-breaking, era-defining masterpiece, never actually fought in a major naval battle. Its most famous achievement was ramming a German submarine in 1915. The world's most advanced battleship, designed to sink fleets at 10 miles with its massive guns, eventually won its only victory by acting as a very large, very expensive rowboat that ran into something by accident. By the time the Great War truly got underway, the dreadnought was already considered a bit old-fashioned. Newer, super dreadnoughts had been built. The cycle of obsolescence that Jackie Fisher had started in 1906 had consumed its own creator. As the year 1906 drew to a close, the world was a louder, faster, and much more expensive place. Britain had its big boat, Germany had its new ambition, and the oceans were filled with the sound of steam turbines and the quiet sobbing of various treasuries. We had learned that while you can dread naught, you should probably at least worry a little bit when you decide to break your own toys just to show off your new ones. Chapter 9. The SOS Signal. 3 dots, 3 dashes, and a prayer. If there is one thing that humanity has mastered over the last few millennia, it is the art of being remarkably difficult to understand at the exact moment when understanding is most required. We have built towers of Babel, developed thousands of dialects, and invented the legal contract, all in a collective effort to ensure that no two people are ever quite on the same page. However, by 1906, we had added a new layer of complexity to our confusion: wireless telegraphy. Wireless was the miracle of the age. It allowed a man on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic to insult a man in a London office without the inconvenience of a 3,000-mile copper wire. But the problem with wireless in 1906 was that it was less of a system and more of a high-altitude shouting match. Every company had its own equipment, its own operators, and, most dangerously, its own secret language for saying, "Please come help me. I am currently standing on a deck that is increasingly becoming a basement." The CQD era, Marconi's alphabetical monopoly. Before the events of 1906, the dominant force in the wireless world was the Marconi Company. Guglielmo Marconi, a man who viewed the airwaves as his personal backyard, had decreed that his operators would use the signal CQD to indicate distress. Now, CQD didn't actually stand for Come Quick Danger, although that is what most sailors believed. In reality, CQ was the general call for all stations, and the D was added for distress. It was a logical, bureaucratic solution to a problem that is fundamentally illogical and chaotic. The trouble was that CQD sounds a lot like CQ in Morse code if the operator is nervous, the weather is bad, or the ship is tilted at a 30-degree angle. It lacked the rhythmic punch required to wake up a sleepy operator in a distant lighthouse who was mostly interested in his tobacco pipe and the Sunday papers. The Berlin Wireless Conference, bureaucracy, versus the deep blue sea. In October 1906, representatives from 29 nations gathered in Berlin for the International Radio-Telegraphic Convention. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of men who were deeply worried about German industrialism. The Germans, who were tired of Marconi's monopoly on the English language, proposed a different signal. They had been using SOE on their own ships. However, there was a technical hitch. The letter E in Morse code is a single dot. In the middle of an Atlantic gale, with the atmospheric electricity popping and the sparks flying, a single dot is as easy to miss as a polite "excuse me" at a riot. After much debate, the committee decided to change the E to another S. Thus, SOS was born. The myth of the acronym. Contrary to every maritime adventure novel ever written, SOS does not stand for Save Our Souls, nor does it stand for Save Our Ship, Send Out Succor, or, as the more pessimistic sailor suggested, Sink or Swim. In the dry, unromantic world of the Berlin Conference, SOS was chosen for one reason, and one reason only. It was impossible to ignore. S, 3 dots. O, 3 dashes. S, 3 dots. It is a rhythmic, symmetrical, and unmistakable pattern. It is the audio equivalent of a strobe light. Even an operator who had spent the last 6 hours listening to the static of a thunderstorm could hear that distinctive dit, 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 da, 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 dit, 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 and realize that someone, somewhere, was having a very bad Tuesday. The pride of the operator. You would think that once a universal signal for help was established, everyone would immediately adopt it. But humans are sentimental creatures, especially when it comes to their habits. Marconi operators continued to use CQD for years afterward, viewing SOS as a German invention that wasn't quite up to British standards. When the Titanic went down a few years later, a ship that was practically a floating monument to the dreadnought philosophy of 1906, the senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, spent the first hour of the disaster tapping out CQD. It was only when his junior colleague jokingly suggested, "Send SOS. It's the new signal, and it may be your last chance to send it," that he switched. In 1906, however, the adoption of SOS was a sign of a new globalized reality. It was a rare moment where we decided that the survival of a drowning sailor was more important than the pride of a corporate trademark. We had created a silent signal, a way to speak across the void without needing a dictionary. The physics of the spark. To send an SOS in 1906 was not a simple matter of pressing a button. It involved a spark gap transmitter, a machine that basically created a localized bolt of lightning inside the radio room. When the operator pressed the key, a massive blue spark would jump between 2 electrodes, emitting a crackle that sounded like a Gatling gun and a smell of ozone that could peel paint. It was a violent, heroic way to communicate. You weren't just sending a message, you were beating the atmosphere into submission. There is something profoundly poetic about the fact that we spent centuries perfecting the arts of war and empire only to find that our greatest technological achievement was a way to admit we were lost. An unverified yet likely accurate sentiment from a 1906 telegraphist. The SOS legacy. By the end of the year, the SOS had been ratified. It became the official Morse code for, "I shouldn't have bought a ticket on this boat." It was the first truly international word, a word that belonged to no nation and was understood by all. It represented the end of the gentleman's navy and the beginning of the connected world. We were no longer alone on the ocean. We were all connected by an invisible web of dots and dashes. Of course, the irony is that while we had finally figured out a way to say help, we still hadn't quite mastered the art of making sure there were enough lifeboats for everyone who was shouting it. As 1906 rolled into 1907, the airwaves were humming. We had dreadnoughts to sink the ships, SOS to report the sinking, and insurance grifts to pay for the replacement. It was a closed loop of human ingenuity and absurdity. Chapter 10. The Simplon Tunnel, a hole through the heart of the Alps. If there is one thing that the Victorian and Edwardian mind could not tolerate, it was the existence of a natural obstacle. To a man of the early 20th century, a mountain was not a majestic symbol of the sublime or a testament to the slow, patient sculpting of the Creator. It was an inefficient detour. The Alps, while aesthetically pleasing in a postcard sort of way, were primarily viewed by the engineers of 1906 as a massive, jagged pile of granite that was rudely standing between the fine wines of Italy and the heavy industry of Switzerland. For centuries, if you wanted to get from Brig to Icelle, you had to follow the footsteps of Hannibal or Napoleon, which involved a great deal of heavy breathing, the risk of frostbite, and the distinct possibility of being stared at by an unimpressed mountain goat. But by 1906, humanity had decided that scenery was an overrated commodity. We wanted to get where we were going, and we wanted to do it in the dark, at 30 miles an hour, while drinking a lukewarm cup of bouillon. Thus, we gave birth to the Simplon Tunnel, a 12-mile-long testament to the fact that man will go to any depth, quite literally, to avoid a brisk walk in the fresh air. The Great Geological Staring Contest. The Simplon Tunnel was not just a hole. It was a 12-year-long boxing match between European iron will and several million tons of recalcitrant rock. The plan was simple in the way that all catastrophic ideas are simple. Start digging in Switzerland, start digging in Italy, and hope that you meet in the middle with enough accuracy that you don't end up with two very expensive dead ends and a very awkward conversation with the shareholders. The engineers, led by the intrepid Alfred Brandt, used brand-new hydraulic drills that could chew through granite like a hungry schoolboy through a ginger snap. But the Alps did not go quietly. The mountain had secrets, and most of them involved water. As the workers pushed deeper, they didn't just find rock. They found subterranean rivers and high-pressure hot springs that turned the tunnel into a 12-mile-long Turkish bath. At the center of the tunnel, the temperature reached a staggering 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 54 degrees Celsius. It was so hot that the drills had to be cooled with jets of ice water, and the workers had to be rotated out every few hours before they were literally poached. It is the only engineering project in history where the primary occupational hazard was being accidentally cooked by the scenery you were trying to avoid. The precision of the blind There is a particular kind of terror that comes with being a lead engineer on a tunnel project. You are betting your reputation, your fortune, and the lives of thousands of men on the hope that your math is better than the mountain's ability to confuse you. When the two sides finally met in February 1905, leading up to the official opening in 1906, the error in their alignment was less than 4 inches for a 12-mile tunnel dug through the dark, wet bowels of a mountain range that is not just engineering, it is a miracle. It suggests that while the workers were sweating and swearing in the heat, the mathematicians were back in their offices, coolly defying the laws of probability with nothing but a slide rule and a sense of divine right. On May 19, 1906, King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy and the President of the Swiss Confederation met at the border, which was now a damp spot in the middle of a dark hole, to declare the tunnel open. They celebrated the fact that the Alps had been conquered. We had finally poked a hole in the fortress of Europe. Man is the only animal that will spend a decade and several $1 million digging a hole just so he can avoid looking at a mountain. A mole does it for worms. A man does it for the sake of the timetable. A sentiment often felt, though rarely expressed, by the passengers of the Orient Express. The death of the mountain pass. The opening of the Simplon Tunnel changed the world in a way that is difficult for us to grasp in an age of jet engines and satellite navigation. Before the tunnel, the Alps were a physical manifestation of no. They were a boundary that separated cultures, languages, and climates. After 1906, the Alps were just a ceiling. The Great St. Bernard Pass and the Simplon Pass, routes that had been trodden by emperors and pilgrims for 2 millennia, suddenly became the exclusive domain of the eccentric and the impoverished. If you had the money, you took the train, you entered a tunnel in the morning, saw nothing but the flickering light of a gas lamp for 20 minutes, and emerged in a different country with a different language and a slightly different way of preparing veal. This is the essence of 1906 progress. It is the systematic removal of the journey in favor of the destination. We decided that the experience of the Alps was an obstacle to the efficiency of the Alps. We traded the golden eagle and the glacier for the soot of the locomotive and the damp walls of the vault. The moral implication of the shortcut. One has to wonder what the mountains thought of all this. There they were, standing for millions of years, surviving the Ice Age and the rise and fall of Rome, only to have a group of frantic Europeans in bowler hats tickle their underbellies with dynamite. It was an indignity of the highest order. The Simplon Tunnel taught us that there is no part of the earth that is sacred if it stands in the way of a more direct route to a trade deal. It was the dreadnought of civil engineering, a project so massive and so expensive that it made every other tunnel look like a rabbit hole. It proved that if you throw enough money, ice water, and Italian laborers at a problem, even the Earth's crust will eventually give up and let you through. By the end of the year, the tunnel was a resounding success. The mail moved faster. The tourists arrived in Milan with less dust on their coats. The Swiss and the Italians were closer than ever, separated only by 12 miles of rock and a very long history of mutual suspicion. We had successfully rearranged the furniture of the continent. We had built a city on a fault line in San Francisco. We had cleaned the rats out of the sausage in Chicago. and now we had tunneled under the mountains of Switzerland. 1906 was the year humanity decided it didn't like the floor, the food, or the walls of its house, and it was going to change them all at once. As the trains rumbled through the dark, cold heart of the Simplon, the passengers sat in their velvet seats, reading their newspapers and checking their watches. They didn't look out the windows because there was nothing to see. And in 1906, that was exactly what they had paid for. Chapter 11. Kellogg's Corn Flakes, the End of Flavor. If the first half of 1906 was dedicated to the earth shaking our houses down and the fire burning up what was left, the second half of the year was dedicated to a much more insidious form of destruction, the systematic removal of joy from the American breakfast table. We had survived the ham and eggs fire of San Francisco, but we were about to be defeated by a bowl of toasted cardboard and a man with a moral mission. Enter Will Keith Kellogg and the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company. To understand the corn flake, you must first understand the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a place where the wealthy went to be politely tortured in the name of biological living. It was presided over by Will's brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, a man who possessed a mustache of biblical proportions and a medical philosophy that viewed the human digestive tract as a battlefield between God and the devil. The sanitarium, where fun went to die. Dr. Kellogg believed that the American diet was a roadmap to perdition. He looked at a steak and saw a ticket to the underworld. He looked at a cup of coffee and saw a nervous breakdown in a mug. According to the doctor, the secret to a long moral life was a diet so bland that the soul would have nothing to do but focus on higher things. He believed that spicy foods, meat, and, heaven forbid, flavor were the primary causes of impure thoughts and social unrest. At the sanitarium, guests were subjected to a regimen of cold baths, rhythmic calisthenics, and a diet that consisted mostly of nuts, grains, and an unshakable sense of guilt. It was here, in this laboratory of joyless mastication, that the corn flake was accidentally born. The accidental flake, a culinary tragedy. The invention occurred when a batch of cooked wheat was left out for too long. Instead of throwing it away, which would have been the merciful thing to do, the Kellogg brothers ran it through some rollers. To their surprise, the stale grain didn't come out as a sheet. It came out as tiny, thin flakes. They toasted them, served them to the patients, and discovered that people were actually willing to eat them, mostly because anything was better than the proto-se, a meat substitute made of gluten that had the texture of an old boot. But while the doctor viewed the flake as a medicinal tool for suppressing the animal passions, his brother Will saw something else: profit. The Great Sugar Schism. Will Kellogg was a businessman with a dangerous idea. He thought people might actually like food if it didn't taste like a sun-dried manila folder. He proposed adding sugar to the flakes. To Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, this was heresy. Adding sugar to a cornflake was like adding a jazz band to a funeral. It was unseemly, it was dangerous, and it would undoubtedly lead to a collapse of the nation's moral fiber. The brothers had a falling out that would make a Shakespearean tragedy look like a minor misunderstanding over a lawnmower. Will walked away, took the flakes with him, and in 1906, he launched the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company. He put his signature on every box, literally, to ensure that the public knew they were getting the genuine flakes, the ones that had been tainted with the delicious sweet sin of sucrose. Marketing the moral fiber. The marketing of corn flakes in 1906 was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Will Kellogg didn't just sell cereal, he sold civilization. He targeted the American housewife, promising her that she could save hours of labor by simply pouring a box of flakes into a bowl instead of slaving over a hot stove to produce a nutritious but morally compromising breakfast of sausage and griddle cakes. He used slogans that suggested the cereal was the sweetheart of the corn. He bought full-page advertisements in magazines telling readers to wink at your grocer and see what you get. Presumably, you got a box of cereal and not a restraining order, though in 1906, the results of such an experiment were likely mixed. The brilliance of the cornflake was that it managed to retain the aura of health, while providing the quick hit of energy that a booming industrial nation required. We were a country in a hurry. We didn't have time to chew our way through a side of bacon anymore. We needed a breakfast that we could inhale while running to catch the streetcar to our jobs at the insurance office or the steel mill. The end of the flavorful frontier. But what did we lose in the process? We lost the flavorful frontier. Before the cornflake, a man's breakfast was an event. It was a greasy, hearty, unapologetic celebration of the fact that you had survived the night. It was eggs fried in lard, ham cured in salt, and biscuits that could double as doorstops. It was a meal that stayed with you until Tuesday. The cornflake changed all that. It introduced the concept of the light breakfast, a meal so insubstantial that you felt like you had eaten a cloud that had been passed through a sieve. It was the beginning of the efficiency movement in the human stomach. We were treating our bodies like the boilers of the HMS Dreadnought, shoveling in fuel as quickly as possible so we could get back to the business of making money. The cornflake is the perfect food for a man who wants to live forever, but has forgotten why he wanted to in the first place. It provides the illusion of sustenance without the burden of enjoyment. A sentiment Mark Twain might have whispered into his beard while longing for a pork chop. The moral implications of the crunch. By the end of 1906, Will Kellogg was selling 1 million boxes of cereal a year. The Battle Creek idea had conquered the American pantry. We had convinced ourselves that by eating these toasted bits of maize, we were becoming better, cleaner, and more modern people. There is a profound irony in the fact that we spent the first half of the year passing the Meat Inspection Act to ensure our beef was safe, only to spend the second half of the year deciding we didn't want to eat the beef anyway, because a man with a mustache told us that corn was more spiritual. The cornflake was the first processed food to truly capture the American imagination. It taught us that food didn't have to come from a farm. It could come from a factory. It didn't have to be prepared by a cook. It could be dispensed by a machine. It was the precursor to the TV dinner, the protein bar, and that strange neon-colored cheese that comes in a pressurized can. The legacy of the toasted folder. Today, we look back at 1906 as the year of the Great Earthquake, but for the American palate, the arrival of the cornflake was the real fault line. It shifted our relationship with our food from one of pleasure to one of maintenance. We began to count things. We counted calories, though we didn't call them that yet. We counted moral fiber, and we counted the minutes we saved by not having to wash a frying pan. Will Kellogg became a titan of industry. His brother, the doctor, continued to give enemas to the elite in Battle Creek, and the rest of us learned to live with the crunch. As the year 1906 drew to a close, the American people were safer, cleaner, and better regulated than ever before. We had SOS to save us at sea, national monuments to save our rocks, and cornflakes to save our souls. It was a world of perfect order, provided you didn't mind the fact that everything suddenly tasted a bit like the box it came in. Chapter 12. The Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. By the middle of 1906, the horse, that noble four-legged relic of a slower era, was starting to realize that his tenure as the king of the road was coming to a very messy end. For thousands of years, if you wanted to go somewhere without walking, you had to negotiate with a creature that was prone to being spooked by its own shadow, required a constant intake of hay, and possessed an exhaust system that necessitated a dedicated municipal department with shovels and very strong stomachs. The early motor cars that attempted to replace the horse were not initially an improvement. They were essentially vibrating lawn mowers with delusions of grandeur. They were loud. They smelled like a kerosene lamp having a nervous breakdown, and they were so unreliable that "get a horse" became the official heckle of the American pedestrian. If you drove a car in 1905, you didn't just need a hat and goggles. You needed a master's degree in mechanical engineering and a willingness to spend your Sunday afternoon lying in the dirt under a leaking crankcase. But then, in late 1906, the British, a people who have always believed that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing with an excessive amount of dignity and a very high price tag, unveiled the Rolls-Royce 40-50 horsepower, better known to the world as the Silver Ghost. The odd couple of the asphalt. The Silver Ghost was the offspring of two men who were as different as a tuxedo and a wrench. Charles Rolls was a posh aristocrat with a thirst for speed and a voice that probably sounded like velvet sliding over fine china. He was the salesman, the face, and the man who eventually proved his commitment to speed by becoming the first Briton to die in an airplane crash. Though that's a tragedy for a later chapter. Henry Royce, on the other hand, was a man who viewed perfection not as a goal, but as a minimum requirement. Royce was a mechanical obsessive who likely would have tried to improve the design of a paperclip if you gave him 5 minutes and a magnifying glass. His philosophy was simple. Take the best that exists and make it better. When it does not exist, design it. In 1906, what did not exist was a car that didn't sound like a Gatling gun in a trash can. Royce decided to fix that. He built a 6-cylinder engine so smooth and so precisely machined that you could reportedly balance a silver shilling on its edge on the radiator while the engine was idling. If the coin fell, Royce didn't just fix the car. He probably apologized to the coin. The name. Why a ghost? The car was originally painted silver, and it moved with such a lack of auditory drama that the company's managing director, Claude Johnson, decided to name the 13th chassis the Silver Ghost. In 1906, silence was the ultimate luxury. We lived in a world of clanging streetcars, steam whistles, iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, and the aforementioned ham and eggs fires. To move through a city without making a sound was more than just a mechanical feat. It was a supernatural one. It suggested that you weren't just traveling, you were haunting the pavement. The Silver Ghost didn't chug, it didn't put. It emitted a faint, aristocratic hum that whispered to the peasants, "I am currently worth more than your entire village, and I am moving toward a very expensive lunch." The chauffeur, the new high priest of the garage. With the arrival of the Silver Ghost, the relationship between the owner and the machine changed forever. In the early days, driving was a sport for the hands-on enthusiast, but the Silver Ghost was designed for the man who didn't want to know how the engine worked. He just wanted to be certain that it did. This gave rise to a new social class, the chauffeur. A chauffeur in 1906 was part pilot, part valet, and part sacrificial lamb. He was the one who had to wear the leather leggings and the stiff-collared tunic. He was the one who had to understand the Silver Ghost instruction manual, which was written with the gravity of a liturgical text. The owner sat in the back, encased in a Barker body, made of the finest leather and wood, shielded from the wind and the dust, while the chauffeur sat out in the elements, steering the Silver Spirit through the chaos of the world. It was the peak of Edwardian class distinction. You could tell the importance of a man by the distance between his nose and the radiator of his Rolls-Royce. The 15,000-mile reliability trial. To prove that the Silver Ghost wasn't just a fragile toy for the idle rich, the company entered the car into a series of grueling reliability trials in 1907, based on the 1906 design. The most famous was a 15,000-mile run between London and Glasgow, which the car completed with only one involuntary stop, a faulty fuel cock worth about 2 shillings. For a car in 1906 to drive 15,000 miles without the engine exploding or the wheels falling off was the equivalent of a modern man walking to the moon and back without needing a Band-Aid. It established the Rolls-Royce as the best car in the world, a title the company bestowed upon itself with a lack of modesty that would have made a peacock blush, but which everyone else had to admit was probably true. The Insurance Grift, Automotive Edition. The user mentioned sobbing over the insurance premiums, and while the term insurance in 1906 was still largely reserved for ships and burning buildings in San Francisco, the Silver Ghost introduced the world to the concept of prohibitive maintenance. Owning a Rolls-Royce wasn't just a purchase. It was a lifestyle of high-end anxiety. Because every part was machined to such terrifying tolerances, you couldn't just take it to the local blacksmith if it broke. You had to wait for a man from Derby to arrive on a train carrying a specialized wrench and a sense of superiority. The cost of ownership became a way for the wealthy to signal that they had so much money they could afford to keep a ghost in their garage. A Rolls-Royce is the only machine that allows a man to arrive at his destination with exactly the same amount of dignity he had when he left, which, in the case of the British aristocracy, is a very great deal of dignity indeed. A thought that might have occurred to Charles Rolls just before he tried to fly. The sunset of the Golden Age. As the year 1906 drew to a close, the Silver Ghost stood as the ultimate symbol of the Belle Époque, that beautiful gilded era where everything seemed to be getting better, quieter, and more refined. We had the HMS Dreadnought to guard the seas. We had corn flakes to keep our thoughts pure, and we had the Silver Ghost to glide us toward the future. We didn't know yet that the ghost was a hauntingly appropriate name. In less than a decade, the silence of the Edwardian afternoon would be shattered by the roar of the very engines Henry Royce had perfected as they were bolted into airplanes and tanks. The Silver Ghost was the peak of a world that was about to vanish in a cloud of cordite and wood smoke. But for a brief moment in 1906, you could stand on a street corner in London, hear absolutely nothing, and then see a flash of silver light move past you. It was the future, and it was moving so quietly that you didn't even hear it coming. Chapter 13. The Death of Susan B. Anthony. In March of 1906, while the tectonic plates under San Francisco were still stretching their limbs and Will Kellogg was dreaming of a world made of corn, a quiet but monumental shift occurred in a modest brick house in Rochester, New York. Susan B. Anthony, a woman who had spent the better part of 86 years acting as the human equivalent of a persistent pebble in the shoe of the American patriarchy, finally decided she had earned a rest. To the men of the early 20th century, Susan B. Anthony was more than just a reformer. She was a terrifyingly logical force of nature. She didn't just want the vote. She wanted the world to admit that women were not merely decorative furniture with a talent for embroidery and a tendency toward the vapors. She spent her life insisting that a woman's brain was capable of processing complex political thought, a radical notion in an era when most men believed that if a woman thought too hard, her uterus might detach and wander off toward her spleen. The Crime of the Century, 1872 edition. You cannot understand the legend of Susan B. Anthony without revisiting her greatest criminal act. In 1872, she had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to walk into a polling place in Rochester and cast a ballot for Ulysses S. Grant. Now, in the 1870s, this was viewed with the same level of horror as if she had walked into the polling place and attempted to sacrifice a goat. She was promptly arrested. During her trial, the judge, a man who clearly viewed his bench as a fortress against the encroaching tides of common sense, refused to let her testify in her own defense. He argued that as a woman, she was incompetent to provide evidence regarding her own intent. When the judge eventually ordered the jury to find her guilty without even letting them deliberate, Anthony didn't just take it. She stood up and delivered a speech that was so sharp, so articulate, and so devastatingly witty that the judge had to repeatedly bang his gavel just to remind himself he was still in charge. He fined her $100. She looked him in the eye and told him she wouldn't pay a single penny of his unjust claim. And she didn't. She stayed a fugitive from justice for the rest of her life, proving that $100 is a very small price to pay for the pleasure of telling the United States government exactly where it can stick its fines. The irony of the protected woman. The common argument against Susan B. Anthony in 1906 was that women didn't need the vote because they were protected by their husbands and fathers. This was the great Edwardian fairy tale that every woman lived in a state of perpetual cushioned safety, shielded from the harsh realities of the world by a man in a waistcoat. Anthony spent her life pointing out the holes in this plot. She pointed out the factory girls working 16-hour days for pennies. She pointed out the widows who lost everything because they had no legal standing. She pointed out that protection usually looked a lot like custody. She was a master of the witty rebuttal. When a man told her that women shouldn't vote because they didn't fight in wars, she reminded him that women were the ones who produced the soldiers, which was a far more dangerous and prolonged engagement than any cavalry charge. She suggested that if the ballot were reserved only for those who risked their lives, then every mother in America should have 2 votes to every man's 1. I declare to you that woman must not depend upon the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself. And there I take my stand. Susan B. Anthony, likely while looking at a man who couldn't find his own socks. The 1906 departure, failure is impossible. By the time 1906 rolled around, Anthony was 86 and increasingly frail, but her mind was still as sharp as a meat inspector's hook. Her last public appearance was at a suffrage convention in Baltimore in February. She stood before a crowd of thousands, women who viewed her as a living saint, and uttered the 3 words that would become the movement's mantra: failure is impossible. She died on March 13, 1906. The irony of her death was that she left a world that was modernizing in every way except the one that mattered most to her. We had the HMS Dreadnought to guard the seas, we had the Simplon Tunnel to bypass the mountains, and we had the Triode vacuum tube to amplify signals through the air. We were a species of geniuses who could communicate with light and steam, yet we still hadn't figured out how to trust half the population with a piece of paper and a lead pencil. The newspapers of the day were filled with glowing tributes to the grand old woman. Men who had spent decades calling her a dangerous harridan and a menace to the domestic hearth suddenly found themselves writing flowery obituaries about her noble character and unwavering spirit. It is the classic male maneuver. Once a woman is no longer around to point out your flaws, you turn her into a statue so you don't have to listen to her anymore. The legacy of the unbought vote. Susan B. Anthony's death in 1906 marked the end of the first generation of suffragists. She didn't live to see the 19th Amendment. She didn't live to see a woman in the Senate or a woman running a major corporation. But she did something far more important. She made the status quo look ridiculous. By the time she was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery, the idea that women shouldn't vote had moved from obvious truth to increasingly flimsy excuse. She had won the argument. She just hadn't lived to collect the trophy. There is a particular wit in her legacy. Every year, after an election in the United States, people flock to her gravesite to stick their "I voted" stickers on her headstone. It is a beautiful, colorful, slightly messy tribute, the kind of silent protest she would have loved. It is the ultimate "I told you so," delivered from 86 years of graveyard silence. The world without Susan. As 1906 continued without her, the movement she had championed began to change. The new women were louder, more aggressive, and less inclined to wait for the judge's permission. They had learned from Susan that you don't ask for rights. You simply exert them until the world gets tired of telling you no. We had lost the woman who had dared to vote for Grant, but we had gained a generation that wouldn't stop until they could vote for whoever they damn well pleased. The year 1906 was a year of clearing out the old structures, literally in San Francisco and metaphorically in Rochester. The house at 17 Madison Street became a museum, a shrine to the woman who had realized that progress is just a fancy word for relentless stubbornness. She had spent 86 years telling men they weren't as smart as they thought they were, and as the 20th century began to stumble toward its own catastrophes, the world was about to prove her right on nearly every count. Chapter 14. Mount Vesuvius. Acts up again. If the first few months of 1906 had taught humanity anything, it was that the Earth was currently in the middle of a very messy divorce with its tenants and was expressing its dissatisfaction by throwing the fine china at our heads. We had already witnessed San Francisco being tossed into a blender and the Alps being unceremoniously poked with a 12-mile stick. But while the Americans were busy blaming their chimneys and the Swiss were busy hiding in tunnels, the residents of Naples, Italy, were reminded that they lived at the foot of a landlord who didn't just demand rent, she occasionally demanded the entire neighborhood. Mount Vesuvius, the world's most famous geological prima donna, decided that April 1906 was the perfect time for a comeback tour. The resident dragon of Naples. To live in Naples is to live in a state of beautiful, sun-drenched denial. It is a city of song, opera, world-class pizza, and a giant cone-shaped mountain that has a historical habit of erasing civilizations when it feels neglected. For centuries, Vesuvius had been the brooding backdrop to Neapolitan life, a scenic, smoke-capped prop that added a touch of drama to the skyline. But a volcano is not a prop. It is a chimney for a furnace that has been burning since the dawn of time. By early April, the chimney was clogged, and the furnace was starting to back up. On April 4th, 1906, the mountain stopped brooding and started shouting. This wasn't the polite "excuse me" of a minor tremor. This was a full-throated subterranean roar that suggested the mountain was trying to turn itself inside out. For the next 10 days, Vesuvius didn't just erupt. It performed a systematic demolition of the surrounding countryside. It was the most violent eruption the region had seen in over 300 years, proving that while humanity was busy inventing the HMS Dreadnought, nature was still using the same old-fashioned high-pressure steam and molten rock to make her point. The ash, nature's most unwanted gift. We often think of a volcanic eruption as a river of lava, red, glowing, and moving at the speed of a determined turtle. And while there was plenty of lava in 1906, swallowing the town of Bosco Tracaz like a gourmet appetizer, the real villain of the piece was the ash. Volcanic ash is not like the soft gray soot you find in your fireplace after a cozy evening. It is pulverized rock, sharp, heavy, and possessed by a singular desire to follow the laws of gravity. In Naples, the sky turned the color of a stale bruise. The sun, usually the pride of the Mediterranean, was reduced to a pale, sickly ghost. Then the snow began to fall, but it wasn't cold and it didn't melt. It piled up on the flat roofs of the Italian villas with a deceptive lightness. The tragedy of San Giuseppe Vesuviano. The problem with Neapolitan architecture, aside from its tendency to look better in a painting than in a rainstorm, is that it was designed for sunshine, not for carrying the weight of a mountain on its roof. In the town of San Giuseppe Vesuviano, the local population did what people have done in times of catastrophe for millennia. They ran to the church. They believed that if they prayed hard enough, the mountain might reconsider its position. Upwards of 100 people were huddled inside the church when the weight of the accumulated ash became too much for the roof to bear. The ceiling collapsed, turning a sanctuary into a tomb. It is a grim irony that we see repeated throughout 1906. In San Francisco, people died because they were in their houses. In Naples, they died because they were in their churches. It seems that in the year 1906, the only safe place to be was somewhere else. The king, the queen, and the ash shovel. The reaction to the eruption was a fascinating study in Edwardian class dynamics. King Victor Emmanuel III and Queen Elena rushed to the scene. This was the new Italy, and the royals wanted to show that they were men and women of the people. The king was seen trudging through ash, up to his knees, offering words of encouragement to peasants who were currently watching their vineyards turn into a moonscape. It was a very noble gesture, though one suspects the peasants would have preferred a few thousand men with shovels and a working water system over a royal handshake. Meanwhile, in Naples, the city was undergoing a transformation. The ash was so thick that people had to walk with umbrellas to keep from being buried alive while crossing the street. The Paris of the South had become a monochrome nightmare. The famous Neapolitan gaiety was replaced by a frantic, dusty struggle for survival. The science of maybe. The 1906 eruption was also a landmark for the fledgling science of volcanology. The Vesuvius Observatory, located on the slopes of the mountain, was manned by Giuseppe Mercalli, the man who would eventually give his name to the scale we use to measure earthquake intensity. Mercalli and his team stayed at their posts while the mountain was literally exploding around them. They recorded the tremors, analyzed the gases, and tried to predict when the big one was coming. It was a heroic display of scientific dedication, or perhaps just a very extreme case of being too stubborn to leave the office. Their findings taught us that volcanoes don't just blow up. They breathe. They have pulses. They have warning signs. But in 1906, even the best scientists were still essentially playing a game of guess the pressure with a planet that doesn't like to share its data. A scientist is a man who can tell you exactly why your house is falling down, but who is just as powerless as you are to stop it. He provides the footnotes to your catastrophe. A sentiment likely shared by the residents of Bosco Treques as the lava reached their front doors. The global perspective, a nervous planet. By late April 1906, the world was starting to look at the ground with a great deal of suspicion. In the span of a few weeks, San Francisco had been leveled by an earthquake. Mount Vesuvius had buried the Neapolitan countryside. The Valparaiso earthquake in Chile was just a few months away. It seemed as though the Pacific Rim and the Mediterranean were in a competition to see who could be the most uninhabitable. Newspapers in London and New York began to run editorials asking if the world was coming to an end or if we had simply entered a particularly vibrant period of geological history. The irony was not lost on the thinkers of the time. We were building dreadnoughts to defend our borders from other men, but we had no defense against the very dirt we were standing on. We were tunneling under the Alps to save time, while the mountains themselves were threatening to fall on our heads. The aftermath, dust to dust. When Vesuvius finally fell silent in mid-April, the damage was staggering. Hundreds were dead, thousands were homeless, and the agricultural heart of the region was covered in a layer of sterile grit. But, in true human fashion, the rebuilding began almost immediately. The ash was cleared, often by dumping it into the sea, which I'm sure the fish appreciated. The roofs were repaired, and the vineyards were replanted. Volcanic ash, it turns out, makes for excellent fertilizer once you get past the burying your house phase. Within a few years, the slopes of Vesuvius would be green again, and a new generation of Neapolitans would go back to drinking wine and ignoring the smoke at the top of the hill. We are a remarkably forgetful species. We have to be. If we remembered every time the earth tried to kill us, we'd never get anything done. We'd be too busy living in tents in the middle of empty fields, staring nervously at the horizon. Instead, we brush the ash off our coats, buy a box of Kellogg's Corn Flakes, and continue to believe that we are the masters of our domain. 1906 was the year the Earth tried to correct that delusion, but by the time the dust settled in Naples, we were already looking for the next mountain to tunnel through. Chapter 15. The Dreyfus Affair. Better late than never. If the year 1906 was an auction, humanity would be the frantic bidder trying to buy back its dignity after a century of questionable decisions. We had spent the first 6 months of the year watching the earth try to shake us off like a bad habit, and the next few months trying to convince ourselves that eating toasted wood pulp would make us holy. But while the Americans were busy cleaning their sausages and the British were building boats that made their own fleets look like rubber ducks, the French Republic was engaged in an even more strenuous activity, admitting it was wrong. In July 1906, the French government finally, officially, and with a great deal of exhausted sighing, concluded the Dreyfus Affair. This was a national drama that had lasted 12 years, divided every dinner table in France, caused several duels, and proved that a government's ego is the only thing in nature more immovable than a mountain and more fragile than a souffle. The man who was conveniently guilty. To understand the resolution of 1906, one must appreciate the sheer high-gloss absurdity of the original crime in 1894. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish artillery captain in the French army, a man who, by all accounts, was so pathologically boring that his own shadow probably fell asleep while following him. He was patriotic, quiet, and possessed a voice that sounded like a dry hinge. When a cleaning lady, who was actually a spy for the French intelligence service, found a torn-up memo, the infamous bordereau, in a waste-paper basket at the German embassy, the French High Command didn't look for a culprit, they looked for a scapegoat. Dreyfus fit the bill perfectly. He was Jewish, he was from Alsace, which was then part of Germany, and he didn't have enough friends to make his disappearance inconvenient. The Army's handwriting experts were a collection of gentlemen whose qualifications seemed to consist entirely of a vivid imagination and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who didn't eat brie. They looked at the memo and decided it matched Dreyfus's handwriting perfectly, provided you squinted, turned the paper upside down, and were already convinced he was a traitor. The tropical vacation from hell, Devil's Island. Dreyfus was convicted of treason, publicly stripped of his rank, a ceremony that involved a lot of dramatic sword-breaking and gold braid ripping, and sent to Devil's Island. Now, Devil's Island is not a place where you go to find yourself. It is a place where the French government sends you so everyone else can forget you exist. It is a tiny, sun-baked rock off the coast of French Guiana, populated primarily by sharks, fever-carrying mosquitoes, and a profound sense of despair. Dreyfus spent nearly 5 years there in solitary confinement, probably wondering if he had accidentally left a library book overdue, or if the French army was just really, really committed to a prank. Zola and the power of the accusation. The tide began to turn when it was discovered that the real spy was a man named Major Esterhazy, a degenerate gambler with a mustache that suggested he was the villain in a silent film. Even when the evidence against Esterhazy became a literal mountain, the French army responded with the tactical brilliance of a brick wall. They forged more documents to frame Dreyfus. This led to the most famous literary tantrum in history, Émile Zola's J'accuse. In 1898, Zola, the most famous novelist in France, published an open letter to the president on the front page of L'Aurore. He accused the military of a cover-up, the courts of perjury, and the generals of being generally incompetent. It was a masterpiece of vitriol. Zola didn't just tip the table. He set the dining room on fire and invited the neighborhood to watch it burn. The resulting scandal split France into two warring camps: the Dreyfusards, who liked things like truth and justice, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who preferred order, the church, and the army's reputation, even if it was built on a pile of lies. It was the first culture war of the modern era, and it was fought with the kind of ferocity usually reserved for the last croissant at a bakery. July 1906. The final oops! By 1906, the French Republic had grown tired of the shouting. The real spy had fled to England. The man who forged the evidence had committed suicide with a razor, and the government had been replaced by people who were slightly less allergic to the facts. On July 12, 1906, the Court of Cassation, the highest court in France, finally annulled Dreyfus's conviction. They didn't just give him a not guilty. They declared that his conviction had been erroneous and iniquitous, and that there was no evidence he had ever done anything wrong besides exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. The resolution was a masterclass in bureaucratic damage control. Reinstatement: Dreyfus was brought back into the army. Promotion: he was promoted to major, the rank he would have reached if he hadn't been busy being a political prisoner. Decoration: he was awarded the Legion of Honor. It was the French way of saying, "Our bad, Alfred. Here's a shiny medal and a slightly better hat. We trust there are no hard feelings about the 5 years on the Shark Island." Justice is like a slow-moving tortoise that has been distracted by a particularly interesting leaf. It will eventually reach the finish line, but it will be late for the ceremony and will likely have forgotten why it was running in the first place. A sentiment Mark Twain would have endorsed while watching the French generals adjust their monocles. The moral of the story: the ego of the state. The Dreyfus affair taught the world a terrifying lesson that remains relevant today. An institution will almost always choose a convenient lie over an embarrassing truth. The French army didn't frame Dreyfus because they hated him. Though the anti-Semitism was a very large, very ugly factor, they framed him because they couldn't admit they had let the real spy get away. They viewed the honor of the army as something that could be preserved by burying an innocent man. 1906 was the year France admitted that the only way to truly have honor is to occasionally admit that you've been an absolute idiot. The irony of the return. Dreyfus served with distinction in World War I, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. He lived long enough to see the world he knew, a world of horse-drawn carriages and dreadnoughts, collapse into the mud of the trenches. But in 1906, his exoneration was seen as a victory for the new century. It was proof that the rule of law could triumph over the rule of the sword. Of course, while France was patting itself on the back for its newfound sense of justice, it was still maintaining a massive colonial empire and treating its subjects with a level of iniquity that would have made the Dreyfus trial look like a picnic. But that is the beauty of national progress. You only have to fix one disaster at a time. As the year 1906 continued, with Mount Vesuvius cooling and Susan B. Anthony resting, the French people went back to their cafes. The affair was over. The Paris of the West, San Francisco, was in ruins, but the real Paris was finally at peace with its conscience, at least until the next time someone lost a memo in a wastepaper basket. Chapter 16. The Pan American Conference in Rio. The Big Stick's Southern Vacation. By July 1906, the world was beginning to feel like a very crowded dinner party, where several guests had brought uninvited dogs, and everyone was keeping a close eye on the silverware. In the United States, Theodore Roosevelt had spent the year performing a high-wire act of progressivism that involved cleaning up the sausages in Chicago while simultaneously reminding the rest of the Western Hemisphere that he owned the backyard. South America, in particular, was feeling a bit twitchy. They had watched the U.S. liberate Cuba, take over the Philippines, and start digging a very large trench in Panama with the enthusiasm of a terrier in a flower bed. To the nations south of the equator, the Monroe Doctrine, originally intended to keep Europeans out, was starting to look like a members-only sign, where the United States was the only member allowed to have any fun. So, in an effort to prove that the Big Stick was actually a very large decorative olive branch, T.R. dispatched his Secretary of State, Elihu Root, to the Third Pan American Conference in Rio de Janeiro. The man with the iron collar, Elihu Root. Elihu Root was the perfect man for the job because he possessed a quality that Theodore Roosevelt famously lacked: subtlety. Root was a corporate lawyer by trade, a man whose natural habitat was the mahogany-paneled room and whose primary weapon was the semicolon. While Roosevelt wanted to charge up hills shouting, Root preferred to sit quietly and rewrite the contract until the other side didn't realize they'd lost their shoes. Root arrived in Rio in July 1906, becoming the first sitting U.S. Secretary of State to go on an official foreign tour. He traveled on the USS Charleston, a cruiser that provided a lovely ironclad backdrop for his message of peace. It's much easier to convince your neighbors that you come in friendship when you arrive on a floating fortress that can level their downtown district from 3 miles out. Rio, the tropical stage. Rio de Janeiro in 1906 was in the middle of its own San Francisco moment, minus the earthquake. The city was undergoing a massive urban renewal project intended to turn it into the Paris of the tropics. They were tearing down slums, widening boulevards, and trying to convince the local mosquitoes to stop giving everyone yellow fever. The conference was held in the Monroe Palace, a building that had been moved piece by piece from the St. Louis World's Fair. There is something beautifully absurd about holding a conference on Latin American sovereignty inside a building named after a U.S. policy, which had been imported from Missouri. It was the architectural equivalent of a property of the USA sticker. The Drago doctrine, don't shoot the debtor. The main tension at the conference involved a gentleman from Argentina named Luis Maria Drago. Drago was annoyed by a particularly European habit of the time. If a South American country defaulted on a loan, the European powers, usually Britain or Germany, wouldn't just send a sternly worded letter. They would send a fleet of warships to blockade the harbor and seize the customs house. Drago proposed the Drago Doctrine, which stated that public debt should not be used as a pretext for military intervention. It was a radical idea, the notion that you couldn't shoot a man just because he owed you 50 pesos and a cow. The United States was in a bit of a pickle here. On one hand, TR didn't want Europeans shooting people in his hemisphere. On the other hand, TR quite liked the idea of the U.S. being the only one allowed to shoot people for debt. This was the Roosevelt corollary, the idea that the U.S. would act as an international police power. Basically, the U.S. told Europe, "Don't worry about collecting your debts. We'll go down there, break their legs, and get your money for you. It'll be much more neighborly that way." The Good Neighbor Rehearsal. Elihu Root's job was to stand in front of the gathered delegates and tell them, with a straight face, that the United States had no imperial ambitions. He delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of diplomatic fluff. He spoke of fraternal affection, mutual respect, and the sacred rights of sovereignty. He told the delegates, "We wish for no victories but those of peace, for no territory except our own, for no sovereignty except the sovereignty over ourselves." It was a beautiful sentiment. The delegates applauded. The champagne flowed. The Brazilian hosts were so impressed they named a street after him, and yet everyone in the room knew that just a few years prior, the U.S. had helped invent the country of Panama just so they could build a canal there. It was like a wolf wearing a very expensive tuxedo and giving a lecture on the virtues of vegetarianism while still having a bit of wool stuck in its teeth. The success of the surface. By the time Root left Rio in August 1906, the conference was declared a triumph of Pan-Americanism. We had agreed to look into arbitration. We had agreed to cooperate on sanitary regulations, mostly to stop the yellow fever from traveling north. We had even agreed to have another conference in a few years. But the real success was for the American brand. Root's tour was the first major U.S. public relations campaign in South America. He kissed babies, metaphorically, toasted presidents, and managed to stay in the tropics for weeks, without once mentioning that the U.S. Navy was currently the third largest in the world and growing faster than a weed. Diplomacy is the art of telling a man to go to hell in such a way that he actually looks forward to the trip. Elihu Root was so good at it that by the time he left Rio, the South Americans were almost convinced that the big stick was actually a very large wooden gift, an observation that would have paired well with a glass of Brazilian cachaça. The reality check. While Root was talking about sovereignty in Rio, the U.S. was preparing to intervene in Cuba again, and was keeping a very close eye on the finances of the Dominican Republic. The big stick wasn't put away. It was just being held behind Root's back while he shook hands with his front one. 1906 was the year the United States learned that it is much cheaper and more efficient to manage an empire through influence and finance than through occupation. Why bother owning a country when you can simply own its debt, its railroads, and its fruit companies? It was the birth of dollar diplomacy, a subtler, more cornflake-approved version of imperialism. As Elihu Root sailed back to Washington, he left behind a hemisphere that was slightly less terrified, but no less confused. We had established that the 20th century in the Americas would be a family affair, provided everyone remembered that Uncle Sam was the one who controlled the trust fund and decided who sat at the head of the table. Chapter 17. The Triode Vacuum Tube, the glass bulb that shrank the world. By the autumn of 1906, humanity had successfully poked holes in the Alps, cleaned the sawdust out of the sausage, and built a boat so large it made the ocean feel like a backyard pond. We were, quite literally, feeling ourselves. But for all our mechanical prowess, we were still remarkably quiet. If you wanted to talk to someone in another city, you had to scream into a telephone that sounded like it was filled with angry bees, or send a telegram that arrived with the speed of a contemplative snail. The problem was strength. A signal, be it a voice over a wire or a spark through the air, is a fragile thing. By the time a whisper from New York reached New Jersey, it was exhausted. It needed a nap. It needed a boost. We had the spark, but we didn't have the breath. Enter Lee DeForest, a man who would eventually be known as the father of radio, mostly because he spent 30 years suing anyone who tried to call him anything else. DeForest was a brilliant, prickly, and pathologically litigious inventor who looked at a light bulb and wondered if he could make it talk. The era of the angry spark. Before 1906, wireless communication was a violent affair. As we discussed in Chapter 9, the Marconi style of telegraphy involved a spark gap transmitter, a machine that essentially created a localized lightning storm to shove a signal across the Atlantic. It was loud, it was inefficient, and it was binary. It could say yes or no, dot or dash, but it couldn't sing, and it certainly couldn't tell you the weather in a pleasant baritone. The world was waiting for the continuous wave. We needed a way to control the flow of electricity with the delicacy of a watchmaker rather than the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The invention of the audione, the third leg of the stool. In 1904, an Englishman named John Ambrose Fleming had invented the diode, or the Fleming valve. It was a vacuum tube with two elements, a heated filament and a metal plate. It was very good at turning alternating current into direct current, acting like a one-way turnstile for electrons. It was clever, but it was a passive device. It couldn't make a signal stronger. It could only tell it which way to go. In late 1906, Lee DeForest decided to add a third element to the party. He took a Fleming valve and, in a moment of either divine inspiration or desperate tinkering, inserted a small zigzagging piece of wire between the filament and the plate. He called this the grid. This was the birth of the triode, which DeForest called the audione. By applying a very small amount of electricity to this grid, DeForest discovered he could control a much larger flow of electricity between the filament and the plate. It was the first amplifier. Think of it this way. If the electricity flowing through the tube was a roaring waterfall, the grid was a tiny faucet handle. By barely moving your pinky on the handle, you could control the power of the entire falls. For the first time in history, we could take a whisper of a radio wave from across an ocean and turn it into a shout. The genius who didn't understand his own genius. Here is the delightful irony of 1906. Lee De Forest had just invented the most important device of the 20th century, the ancestor of the television, the radar, and the computer. And he had absolutely no idea how it worked. De Forest was convinced that the audion needed a little bit of gas inside the bulb to function. He believed the ions in the gas were the secret sauce. Because of this, his early tubes were soft. They had a little bit of air left in them. In reality, the gas was actually making the tubes erratic and prone to burning out. It wasn't until years later that scientists at GE and AT&T realized that the tube worked better with a perfect vacuum. De Forest had essentially invented the jet engine, but insisted it only worked because of the smell of the kerosene. Lee De Forest is a man who discovered the secret of eternal life and then tried to patent the shovel he used to find it. He was a master of the right result and the wrong reason. A sentiment shared by every patent attorney in Washington between 1906 and 1940. The birth of the electronic brain. The triode was more than just a volume knob for the radio. It was a switch, because the grid could turn the flow of electricity on and off incredibly fast. It became the binary gate. When you look at your smartphone today, you're looking at billions of microscopic descendants of Lee De Forest's 1906 glass bulb. If the HMS Dreadnought was the peak of 19th century mechanical muscle, the audion was the first cell of 20th century electronic intelligence. Without the triode, there is no long-distance telephone. Without the triode, there is no BBC, no NBC, and no War of the Worlds broadcast to terrify the public. We would still be communicating via angry spark, and the Internet would likely consist of a very large man in a lighthouse tapping out LOL in Morse code. The litigious legacy. Of course, because this is 1906, no invention was complete without a decade-long legal battle. Marconi sued De Forest. Fleming sued De Forest. De Forest sued everyone who even looked at a vacuum tube with a suspicious expression. The audion became a legal football, kicked back and forth between courts for years. De Forest was even indicted for fraud at one point because he told investors that his little glass bulb would eventually allow a man to transmit his voice across the Atlantic. The prosecutor claimed this was manifestly impossible, and that De Forest was a charlatan. It turns out the only thing more powerful than a triode is the human capacity for being wrong about the future. De Forest was eventually exonerated, mostly because he was right. He did transmit voices across the Atlantic. He did create the radio age, and he did eventually sell his patents to AT&T for a fraction of what they were worth because he needed the money to pay his lawyers. The ghost in the machine. As the year 1906 drew to a close, the triode was a quiet revolution. It didn't make a sound like Vesuvius, and it didn't shake the ground like San Francisco. It just sat there in a laboratory, glowing with a faint, ghostly blue light. But within that light was the end of isolation. We were no longer bound by the strength of our lungs or the length of our wires. We were beginning to weave an invisible web of signals around the planet. We were preparing for a world where we could hear the thoughts of people thousands of miles away, a development that Mark Twain would surely have found to be a very mixed blessing, considering the quality of most people's thoughts. We had invented the electronic ear, and soon we would give the world a mouth to match it. But before we could get to the radio, we had to learn how to make drawings walk. Chapter 18, the first animated cartoon, Drawings with Wanderlust. By the spring of 1906, humanity had become fairly well acquainted with the idea that things could move. We had the steam engine to move our bodies, the telegraph to move our gossip, and the San Francisco earthquake to move our furniture into the middle of the street without a permit. But art, true, respectable art, was supposed to stay exactly where it was put. A painting was expected to hang on a wall and behave itself. A statue was expected to stand in a park and provide a dignified perch for a pigeon. The very concept of moving art was considered a contradiction in terms like honest politician or delicious health food. Then came J. Stuart Blackton. Blackton was a former vaudeville performer and newspaper illustrator who had looked at the brand new medium of moving pictures and decided that reality was a bit too restrictive. He realized that while a camera could capture a horse running or a train arriving at a station, it couldn't capture the impossible. And so, in April 1906, he released a short film titled Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. It was the birth of the animated cartoon, a development that would eventually lead to the creation of giant talking rodents in white gloves and the complete psychological surrender of the American parent. The Chalkboard Conjurer. Before 1906, animation was limited to mechanical toys like the zoetrope, a spinning cylinder that made a drawing of a bird look like it was flapping its wings if you stared at it long enough to give yourself a migraine. Blackton, however, had a more sophisticated brand of tomfoolery in mind. He didn't use expensive sets or actors who demanded lunch breaks. He used a chalkboard. In the film, Blackton's own hand appears, sketching a man and a woman on a blackboard. Then, and this is where the 1906 audience likely checked their drinks for hallucinogens, the hand disappears and the drawings begin to live. The man winks. The woman rolls her eyes. They interact with each other with a level of domestic snark that was previously reserved for living rooms. To a modern audience accustomed to three-dimensional CGI characters with individual hair follicles, this looks like a crude sketch. To the audience of 1906, it was a supernatural event. It was as if the very walls had decided to start mocking the spectators. People sat in darkened theaters, clutching their hats, watching a piece of chalk perform a comedy routine. The tedium of the impossible. Now, while the result was a 3-minute whimsical romp, the process of creating it was a master class in industrial-grade boredom. Blackton had to invent stop-motion photography. Imagine, if you will, the mental state of a man who draws a face, takes a single photograph, erases the corner of the mouth, draws it 1/16 of an inch higher, takes another photograph, and repeats this process several thousand times. It is the kind of task that would make a monk reconsider his vow of silence. It is less artistic expression and more psychological penance. Blackton was essentially tricking the human eye. The eye, being a lazy and easily fooled organ, sees 24 static images per second and assumes it's watching a continuous event. We don't see the gaps. We see the life. In 1906, Blackton discovered the secret to the infinite lie that you can make anything seem alive if you're willing to spend enough time erasing and redrawing it. The animator is a man who spends 40 hours a week making a drawing of a rabbit move its ears, just so a 5-year-old can spend 30 seconds laughing at it. It is the most lopsided trait of human labor in the history of the world. An unverified yet likely accurate sentiment from a 1906 cinematographer. The death of the still life. The premiere of humorous phases of funny faces marked a fundamental shift in the human imagination. Up until that point, we viewed images as captured moments, a slice of time frozen in amber. Blackton proved that an image could be a living potential. Suddenly, the world realized that if a drawing of a man could wink, then a drawing of a tree could walk, and a drawing of a cow could jump over a moon that was also, conveniently, a drawing. We had removed the gravity from our storytelling. It was a terrifying prospect for the high-minded critics of the day. They argued that cinema should be used to document the great events of the world, the coronation of kings, the launch of the HMS Dreadnought, the ruins of San Francisco. They feared that if we spent too much time watching chalk drawings behave like humans, we would eventually lose our grip on reality. They were, of course, entirely correct. The dark prophecy of the rodent. As I stood in the metaphorical shadows of 1906, I looked at Blackton's funny faces, and I saw a glimpse of the future. I saw a world where these animated creatures would eventually become more famous than the people who created them. I saw a world where a cartoon duck with a speech impediment and a questionable lack of trousers would become a global icon of capitalism. We were witnessing the birth of the commercial muse. In 1906, it was a cute novelty. By mid-century, it would be used to convince children that sugary cereal was a necessary part of a balanced diet and that a certain theme park in Florida was the happiest place on earth, a claim that can only be made by someone who has never stood in a 90-minute line for a 3-minute boat ride while wearing a damp T-shirt. But in 1906, the charm was still innocent. It was the thrill of seeing a line of chalk defy the laws of physics. It was the realization that we could create a world where nothing ever truly broke and no one ever really died. A comforting thought for a nation that had just watched San Francisco burn. The physics of the phantasm. The 1906 cartoon also taught us a great deal about the uncanny valley, that strange, creeping discomfort we feel when something looks almost, but not quite, human. Blackton's faces were just stylized enough to be funny. If they had been too realistic, the audience wouldn't have laughed. They would have screamed and called for an exorcist. We learned that for art to move, it must retain a bit of its fakeness. It must be a caricature of life, not a duplication of it. This is why a cartoon mouse is charming, while a realistic mechanical man is the stuff of nightmares. Blackton understood this intuitively. He didn't want to replace reality. He wanted to parody it. By the end of the year, humorous phases of funny faces was a staple of the vaudeville circuit. It was the triode vacuum tube of the theater, a small, glass-encased miracle that amplified the signals of our own imagination. We were no longer just observers of the world. We were the architects of new ones. As 1906 drew to a close, the drawings were still moving. They haven't stopped since. They have moved from the chalkboard to the celluloid, from the television screen to the digital cloud. We have populated our world with 1 billion funny faces. And in doing so, we have made the real world just a little bit more colorful, a little bit more absurd, and a whole lot louder. Chapter 19. The Valparaiso Earthquake, Nature's Relentless Encores. If the year 1906 were a theater production, by August, the audience would have been justified in demanding a refund, or at the very least, a reinforced helmet. We had already sat through the opening act in San Francisco, which featured a city being turned into a toothpick factory, and a mid-act intermission in Italy, where Mount Vesuvius decided to redecorate Naples in post-apocalyptic ash. Any sensible species would have taken the hint, moved to the center of a very flat, very stable tectonic plate, say, somewhere in the middle of Kansas, and spent the rest of the year staring suspiciously at the horizon. But humanity is not a sensible species. We are a collection of stubborn bipeds with a strange romantic attachment to coastlines, views, and geological fault lines that offer character. And so, while the North Americans were still shaking the plaster out of their hair, the South Americans were about to discover that the Pacific Rim is not just a geographical term. It is a literal ring of fire, and in 1906 it was having a particularly violent tantrum. The jewel in the blender. On the evening of August 16, 1906, the city of Valparaiso, Chile, was the jewel of the Pacific. It was a bustling port, a hub of international trade, and a city built on a series of steep hills that gave it a vertical charm that made San Francisco look like a billiard table. It was a place of funiculars, grand Victorian mansions, and a navy that took itself very seriously. At 7:55 p.m., the Earth decided that Valparaiso's verticality was a bit too ambitious. The earthquake that hit Chile was, by many accounts, even more powerful than the one that had leveled San Francisco 4 months prior. It wasn't just a shake. It was a 4-minute-long industrial strength vibration that suggested the planet was trying to centrifuge the human race back into the sea. If you have ever tried to stand on a rug while a very large and very angry dog is trying to pull it out from under you, you have a faint inkling of the Chilean experience. The irony of the well-built ruin. Now, here is where the wit of history really shows its teeth. Chile, being a country that is essentially one long, narrow strip of land perched on a geological seam, actually knew a thing or two about earthquakes. They had building codes, they had stone foundations, they had a population that didn't panic at a minor tremor any more than a Londoner panics at a bit of drizzle. But 1906 was not a year for minor tremors. It was a year for geological erasure. The grand stone buildings of Valparaiso, designed to withstand the tests of time, turned out to be remarkably efficient at crushing the people inside them. The stone didn't bend. It shattered. The hillsides, saturated by recent rains, didn't just vibrate, they liquidated. Entire neighborhoods performed a slow, graceful slide toward the harbor, turning the jewel of the Pacific into a muddy collection of expensive rubble. Admiral Carreño, the Chilean Iron Fist. In the wake of the disaster, Valparaiso found its own version of San Francisco's General Funston. His name was Admiral Luis Gomez Carreño. Now, if Funston was a man of action, Carreño was a man of biblical action. Within hours of the quake, he had declared martial law with a zeal that would have made a Spartan general feel a bit underprepared. Carreño realized that a ruined city is a playground for the opportunistic. He didn't just set up breadlines, he set up firing squads. His orders were simple. If you were caught looting, you were shot. If you were caught overcharging for bread, you were shot. If you looked like you were thinking about doing something untoward, it was probably best to keep your hands in your pockets and look at your shoes. History records that Carreño managed to keep the city remarkably orderly, which is a polite way of saying that the survivors were too terrified of the admiral to worry about the earthquake. He reportedly had looters shot and then left their bodies in the street with signs that read "Looter" pinned to their chests. It was a very effective, if somewhat extreme, form of urban management. It turns out that when the ground is moving, people crave a leader who stays perfectly, terrifyingly still. The science of the shutter. By late August, the world's scientists were starting to feel like they were chasing an ambulance that was circling the entire planet. The 1906 Valparaiso quake was one of the first to be recorded by a global network of seismographs. In 1906, a seismograph was a beautiful steampunk contraption of brass, weights, and fine needles that scratched lines onto smoked paper. It was an instrument that allowed us to see the Earth's pulse. The records from the Chile quake were so massive that they went off the scale in observatories as far away as Tokyo and London. Scientists began to develop the elastic rebound theory, the idea that rocks on either side of a fault are like a rubber band being stretched until they snap. In 1906, it seemed the Earth was a very large ball of rubber bands, and they were all snapping at once. There was a genuine high-level scientific debate about whether the planet was shrinking as it cooled like an old apple, and whether these earthquakes were the wrinkles forming on the skin. We are told that the Earth is a solid sphere, but in 1906 it behaved more like a bowl of jelly in the hands of a nervous waiter. It is difficult to maintain one's dignity as the master of nature when the nature in question is currently trying to fold you into a crevice. A thought that might have occurred to a Chilean philosopher had he not been busy dodging a falling funicular. The Global Relief Grift, Southern Edition. Just as in San Francisco, the international community rushed to help. Ships from the British, German, and American navies arrived in Valparaiso, carrying supplies, doctors, and a great deal of strategic observation. Every major power wanted to show that they were the most humanitarian, mostly because they wanted to ensure they still had a favorable trade deal once the piers were rebuilt. The insurance companies, still reeling from the San Francisco payouts, looked at the Valparaiso claims and collectively decided that perhaps a career in potato farming would have been more stable. The fallen building clause was once again the most debated piece of literature in the Western Hemisphere. It was a year where the fine print of a contract proved to be more durable than a 12-inch thick granite wall. The Ring of Fire's last laugh. The Valparaiso earthquake was the final definitive proof that the events of 1906 were not isolated incidents. We were living on a planet that was undergoing a systemic adjustment. We were the fleas on the back of a dog that had decided it was time for a very vigorous bath. By the time the fires in Valparaiso were extinguished and Admiral Carreño had run out of looters to shoot, the world was a different place. We had lost our geographical arrogance. We realized that the new century wasn't just going to be about steam turbines and dreadnoughts. It was going to be about survival. We had learned to build higher and faster, but we hadn't yet learned how to build lighter. As the sun set over the Pacific, a sea that had been anything but peaceful in 1906, the people of Chile began to rebuild. They used the same redwood, the same stone, and the same optimism, because that is the true fault line of the human spirit. No matter how many times the earth tries to shake us off, we just keep digging in our heels and asking for another round. Chapter 20. 1907 is packing a suitcase. As the calendar pages of 1906 began to curl and yellow, looking very much like the singed edges of a San Francisco land deed, the world found itself standing on the doorstep of 1907, blinking in the harsh light of a new reality. If 1906 had been a person, it would have been the kind of house guest who arrives without a gift, drinks all your fine brandy, rearranges your furniture by throwing it out the window, and then sets fire to the curtains on the way out. It was a year that didn't just happen. It inflicted itself upon us. And so, as the clock ticked toward midnight on December 31st, humanity sat down to pack its collective suitcase for the journey into 1907. It was a heavy trunk, reinforced with the steel beams of Nob Hill and smelling faintly of ozone and scorched ham. We weren't traveling light. We were carrying the baggage of a century that had promised us a quiet, industrial utopia, and instead delivered a series of geological and political roundhouse kicks to the jaw. The inventory of the Phoenix. The first thing we packed, tucked right there at the top of the suitcase for easy access, was a blueprint for the steel-framed city. San Francisco, once the Paris of the West, was now a skeleton of iron ribs and hopeful scaffolding. The city had learned a lesson that the rest of the world was watching with morbid fascination, that if you want to live on the edge of a cliff, you better be bolted to the bedrock. We packed the sheer, unadulterated spite of the American businessman. By the end of 1906, the ruins of Market Street were already being replaced by buildings that looked suspiciously like the ones that had just burned down, only slightly more fire-resistant, which, in 1906, usually just meant they had fewer lace curtains and more lawyers. We were taking with us the realization that civilization is not a permanent state of grace, but a temporary truce with a planet that has a very short fuse. The tins and the flakes, a moral lunchbox. Next into the suitcase went the sausage claws and a box of Kellogg's Corn Flakes. We were entering 1907 with a stomach that was much better regulated, if significantly more bored. We had traded the adventure of mystery meat for the sterile safety of the USDA stamp. We had decided that progress meant knowing exactly what percentage of our dinner was actually animal, and we had embraced the idea that moral purity could be achieved through the relentless consumption of toasted maize. We packed the square deal, though it was looking a bit battered after the Brownsville affair. We were learning that our heroes, even the ones with the best mustaches and the loudest bullies, were human, which is to say they were capable of a staggering amount of short-sightedness when their pride was on the line. We packed Teddy Roosevelt at the absolute zenith of his powers, a man who viewed the entire planet as a rough ride and was currently looking for the next hill to charge up. The noisy void, vacuum tubes, and SOS. Deep in the side pockets of our 1907 suitcase, we tucked the Audion. Lita Forrest's little glass bulb was humming with the ghosts of 1 billion future conversations. We were taking the electronic ear into a century that was about to become very, very loud. The silent signals of 1906, the SOS, and the wireless sparks were the seeds of a world where no one would ever truly be alone again. For better or, as the internet would eventually prove, much, much worse. We packed the HMS Dreadnought, the boat that had effectively turned the world's oceans into a very expensive pond. We were entering 1907 in the middle of a naval arms race that was draining the treasuries of Europe faster than a hole in a bucket. We had invented a machine so powerful that it made war unthinkable, which is the traditional human way of ensuring that war becomes inevitable. The better late than never files. We didn't forget to pack the Dreyfus exoneration. It was a small, dusty folder labeled Justice, and it had taken 12 years to file correctly. It was a reminder that the truth eventually wins, but only after it has been exhausted by a decade of sprinting against a headwind of institutional ego. We were taking a slightly more honest French Republic into 1907, which was a nice change of pace, even if it didn't help with the price of bread. We also packed the memory of Susan B. Anthony. She hadn't made it to the 1907 train, but she had left her ticket on the seat for the next generation. We were entering a year where the new woman was no longer asking for a seat at the table. She was starting to build her own table and was currently looking for a hammer. If man is indeed the master of his fate, 1906 suggests he is a master who frequently loses his keys and occasionally forgets that the floor is not a permanent fixture. We go into 1907 with our heads held high, mostly so we can see the falling bricks before they hit us. The final verdict of the Twain narration. The global grumble, a shaky foundation. Finally, we packed a seismograph. We had learned in 1906 that the Earth is not a silent stage for our dramas, but an active participant with a very poor sense of comedic timing. From San Francisco to Naples to Valparaiso, the planet had spent the year clearing its throat. We were entering 1907 with a new respect for the Ring of Fire and a nagging suspicion that the ground beneath our feet was merely a suggestion. We were packing a suitcase for a world that was moving faster than we could think. We had cars like the Silver Ghost that were quieter than a whisper, and tunnels like the Simplon that allowed us to ignore the majesty of the Alps in favor of the efficiency of the watch. We were a species of geniuses who were currently in the process of automating our own obsolescence. 1907. The morning after. As we close the lid on the 1906 suitcase and sit on it to make the latches click, we look toward 1907. It looks expensive. It looks like a year of bank panics, which were indeed coming, of continuing strikes, and of the slow, grinding realization that the Gilded Age was starting to lose its luster. The paint was peeling, and underneath we were finding a lot of iron, a lot of steam, and a lot of questions we weren't quite ready to answer, but for now, the suitcase is packed. We have our cornflakes, our inspected ham, our wireless radios, and our steel-framed dreams. We are ready for the loud, shaky ride that 1907 promises to be. 1906 was the year that broke the furniture, but 1907 is the year we start to wonder if we like the old decor better. We have traded the Paris of the West for a city of rivets. We have traded the antiquities for national monuments. And we have traded our silence for a triode hum. It was a hell of a year, 1906. I'm glad it's over, and I suspect the Earth is too. It needs a nap. Unfortunately for the planet, and for us, the 20th century is just getting warmed up. It has a lot more shaking to do, and it's already looking at 1907 suitcase with a very mischievous glint in its eye. The end. This has been Mark Twain.